I would like to call this hearing to order this morning and welcome all of our members of the first panel. We genuinely appreciate your being with us today and your testimony on this very important subject matter of greenhouse gas regulations. I might say that today is the 20th day of our American Energy Initiative. And this morning, as I said, we will focus on the Environmental Protection Agency's greenhouse gas regulations. Now, there are so many regulations coming out of EPA that it's very easy to trivialize the impact of these regulations. EPA's greenhouse gas regulations range from rules setting new emission standards for cars and trucks to complex permitting requirements for donut factories, farmers, to rules affecting power plants. These greenhouse gas rules are a regulatory overreach, in my view, and serve as a backdoor cap and tax policy that Congress rejected in the last Congress. Any action regarding climate change should rest with Congress and not unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats at the Environmental Protection Agency. As a matter of fact, under Lisa Jackson as administrator at EPA, I think she's unequivocally demonstrated that she intends to decide what fuels will be used to produce energy in America. The volume of regulations, the underestimated cost of the regulations, the direct job loss caused by the regulations, and the very brazen legal theories advocated by EPA attorneys has demonstrated, in my view, a callous disregard of some legal precedents. And the lack of concern about the families, for example, of coal miners who lose their jobs, and people who work at utilities that burn coal that lose their job, and the impact that it has on their family, is something that I think we frequently just sweep under the rug. Because we're talking about these regulations are going to create new jobs in other industries, but what about those people that lose their jobs and the impact on them? And I would also just say that not only members of Congress and others affected by these rules, but the courts themselves, I think, are having some rather harsh language about what EPA is doing. In the recent Sackett decision, the Supreme Court unanimously rejected EPA's effort to deny due process to landowners. And one of the justices in writing the opinion said the position taken in this case by the federal government would have put the property rights of ordinary Americans entirely at the mercy of the Environmental Protection Agency. He further said that in a nation that values due process, not to mention private property, such treatment is unthinkable. And then in the recent Luminate case, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected EPA's attempts to disapprove a Texas permit program and said that the EPA's disapproval was based on purported nonconformity with 3 extra statutory standards that the EPA created out of whole cloth. And in the recent Spruce Mine decision, a federal judge rejected EPA's unprecedented attempt to invalidate a West Virginia coal mining permit that had been issued many years before. The court called EPA's rationale magical thinking and a stunning power for an agency to arrogate to itself. And there are many other court decisions pending. We will see what the courts hold in those cases, but there seems to be a trend of holdings, a lot of holdings about magical thinking at EPA. It does seem to be an EPA-fulfilled prophecy that no new coal plants will be built in this country. And on our current path, it appears to be this administration's fulfilled prophecy that electricity prices are going to go up. It's simply not acceptable, and I think we have an obligation and responsibility to work tirelessly with our colleagues to stop these policies that destroy jobs and will increase consumer electricity prices, particularly at this time in our nation's history when we're trying to stimulate our economy. Once again, I do appreciate the witnesses being here, and we look forward to your testimony. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing continues the concerted effort by those of the majority party to weaken the authority of the EPA and to delegitimize the agency's regulation as unnecessary job killers. In an attempt to counteract all the various respected, peer-reviewed studies that show that the environmental protection industry actually creates jobs and stimulates the economy, as well as leading healthier and more productive constituencies. Today we will hear more tall tales that attempt to debunk these facts and lead us to believe that any policy that regulates greenhouse gases will automatically lead to increased job losses. However, it is extremely important, Mr. Chairman, for all of us to remember that just because some a few industry sources tell us that regulating greenhouse gases will be costly and will yield little to no benefit does not make it true. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record a June 6 Chicago Tribune article entitled "Extraordinary Extremes. Climate Scientists Explain Our Crazy Weather." This is an article written by former panelists who once appeared before this subcommittee, Dr. Donald Weebles, a professor in the departments of atmospheric sciences and electrical and computer engineering at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and Mr. Aaron Packman, a civil and environmental engineering professor at Northwestern University. These two climate change experts report that, and I quote, "In March, more than 15,000 warm weather records across our country was broken. My city, Chicago, had its warmest March in recorded history. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration received 223 reports of tornadoes. 80 of these tornadoes occurred in March alone. Ohio and parts of the Southeast faced a string of tornadoes in early March that caused an estimated $1.5 billion worth of damage." Mr. Chairman, these experts note that scientific models suggest that these types of natural disasters are likely related to human-induced climate change. But also, they advise, fortunately, that there are steps that we can take to mitigate these effects. And I quote again, we can grow America's investment in renewable energy, powering more homes with wind and solar energy. We can advance energy efficiency policies and use better appliances and equipment that avoid wasting energy and save money on utility bills. We can manufacture and drive more fuel-efficient cars that save money at the gas pump, lessen America's dependence on foreign oil, and reduce greenhouse gas pollution. Mr. Chairman, my fear for today's debate is that it's being framed in a way where we are presented with a false choice between implementing environmental standards to protect our citizens or allow, quote, job-killing, end quote, EPA regulations to move forward. In fact, history has proven that we can indeed do both. We can protect our environment while also strengthening our economy through sensible and balanced regulations that create jobs and new technologies, protect the public health, increase worker productivity, and promote clean air. We've done precisely this before, and Mr. Chairman, I'm certain and I trust that we will do it again. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time, recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, Chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, for opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was nearly 3 years ago that cap-and-trade legislation was being voted on by this committee and then the full House, and few of us who were involved in that debate are likely to ever forget it. Cap-and-trade, at least for me and many others, was bad news all around, high cost without benefit. Nonetheless, proponents made their case in favor of it, and one of their arguments is very relevant to today's hearing. At the time, EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson and other supporters asserted that enacting cap-and-trade legislation was far less costly alternative to piecemeal EPA regulations seeking to achieve the same ends. I certainly did not agree with their logic that we should pass a bad global warming bill in order to avoid worse nightmares and regulations. But Administrator Jackson was right about one thing. As awful as cap-and-trade energy taxes would have been, the agency's greenhouse gas regs are looking even worse. And EPA has only begun to roll out its regulatory agenda. We're already seeing the agency's greenhouse gas permitting requirements acting as yet another roadblock to the economic recovery and job growth. It's a sad irony that the very job-creating activities this struggling economy screams out for, things like building a new factory or expanding an existing one or boosting electric generating capacity to meet demand, are the precisely what is being targeted by EPA with these burdensome GHG permit requirements. And this new red tape is above and beyond the long list of other measures imposed by the Clean Air Act and other statutes. And there'll be more to follow, including new source performance standards for GHGs from coal-fired power plants and refineries. It's not only the largest employers who are at risk. We're also seeing sign of EPA's GHG regs actions reverberating throughout the rest of the economy, too. Small businesses and farmers that are not directly regulated, at least not yet, are going to have to deal with the higher energy costs that will be passed on to them by those who are. Today, we have a valuable opportunity to listen to the job creators, large and small, who have serious concerns with many respects of EPA's greenhouse gas agenda. I was proud to partner with Congressman Whitfield and Senator Inhofe and many others on both sides of the aisle to address those concerns in H.R. 910, the Energy Tax Prevention Act. And I look forward to continued discussions to ensure a pro-jobs, pro-growth, and pro-energy future for America. I would yield the balance of my time to Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Chairman Upton, and thank you, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Members Waxman and Rush, for holding this hearing. Today we're looking at greenhouse gas regulations. According to the EPA's own model, if we implement everything that they've proposed, we're going to reduce CO2 concentrations in the upper atmosphere by 2.9 parts per million, 2.9. This will result, according to their model, in a temperature reduction that would otherwise have occurred of somewhere between 6 thousandths and 15 thousandths of a degree centigrade by the year 2100. Mr. Chairman, that is such a small difference that you cannot measure it. We don't have the measuring ability to discriminate at that level. Now, I do not believe that a temperature difference of somewhere between 6 thousandths and 15 thousandths of a degree centigrade is going to make one iota of difference in any individual's health on this planet between now and the year 2100. However, I do believe that the additional cost incurred to reach that magnificent reduction is going to be felt by everybody on the planet, to the tune estimated of somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 trillion. $7 trillion. To put that in perspective, the very first car that I bought in 1968 was a 1967 Ford Mustang. I bought it used for about $1,600. Just the additional cost for tailpipe emissions on these various regulations are going to cost in the neighborhood of $4,000 per car. Cost more incrementally per car than the first car I bought, admittedly a used car in 1968. Just doesn't make sense, Mr. Chairman. And hopefully in the next Congress and perhaps even in this Congress we can do something to forestall some of these regulations. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman of California, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, today's hearing is no surprise, but it is deeply disappointing. The Republican majority is holding yet another hearing to condemn EPA action. Could you point me some action to reduce carbon pollution. 18 months into this Congress, the majority still denies the threat posed by climate change and recklessly rejects considering any action to address one of the gravest dangers facing the world today. When it comes to climate change, the Republicans have given new meaning to the phrase, just say no. Congressman Rush and I have written over 10 times to Chairman Upton and Chairman Whitfield, urging them to hold hearings on new scientific findings about climate change. The chairmen have said no to hearings on the harm climate change poses to crop yields and the effects of ocean acidification. They have said no to hearings on the threat from methane releases and the shrinking time left for action. They have said no to hearings on climate change reports issued by the International Energy Agency, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Vatican. Instead of examining the science, House Republicans have voted that climate change does not exist. And they have voted 37 times on the House floor this Congress to block efforts to prevent climate change. The Republicans have also said no to clean energy, which would grow jobs and the economy. They have voted 45 times on the House floor to block investments in clean energy and energy efficiency. The Republicans have voted against cleaner vehicles that save consumers money at the pump and reduce Americans' dependence on oil. They have even voted against better incandescent light bulbs that produce exactly the same light with less energy and lower overall cost. The House Republicans are trying to deny the laws of nature. They have voted to reject the most basic facts and scientific findings. They deny basic physics, which finds that greenhouse gases trap heat. They deny decades of measurements showing steadily rising quantities of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They reject cutting-edge satellite readings showing rising temperatures. And they say they know more than the very best scientists at the preeminent scientific body in our nation, the national academies. And I guess that's why they're not invited to come and testify. Just last week, we learned that the Republican legislators in North Carolina are moving a bill that forbids use of projected rates of sea level rise that are any higher than historical rates for the purposes of state planning. Can you imagine that? They are jeopardizing homes along their coast because accepting reality would conflict with their political ideology. The Republican Party has a choice. It can continue down the path of science denial and continue to pass bills declaring that the sea won't rise. Or it can stop denying the science and start grappling with how to respond to climate change. We have legitimate disagreements about the best response, but science denial is indefensible over the short term and unsustainable over the long term. Already decades of inaction have locked in more warming and higher costs to respond. The longer we wait to say yes, the higher the prices will be. The price of this denial will be paid by the American entrepreneurs, workers, and communities that want to participate in the clean energy economy of the future. It will be paid by the small towns and large cities that face billions of dollars of infrastructure costs from seas that don't heed legislative commands. It will be paid for farmers with less productive crops and communities struggling with persistent droughts and raging wildfires. It will be paid by over 1 million species of animals and plants that may go extinct. The price of this denial will be paid by many generations to come, starting with our own children and grandchildren. This is worse than disappointing. It's shameful. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. At this time, are there any other opening statements? Okay. This time, we welcome the first panel once again, and I'll introduce all of you at this point. First of all, we have Mr. Rob McKay, who is the President and CEO of the American Bakers Association. We have Mr. Carl Shafter, who's President of the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau. We have Mr. Charles Smith, who's the President and CEO of Country Mart Cooperative. We have Mr. Daniel Weiss, who's the Senior Fellow and Director of Climate Strategy at the Center for American Progress. We have Dr. William Chamides. Would you pronounce it for me, Doctor?
It's Chamides, but I'm using lots of different variations, as you might expect.
Okay. Well, we thank you for being here, and he is the Dean and Nicholas Professor of the Environment at Duke University. We have Dr. Lewis Anthony Cox, who's the Clinical Professor of the Colorado School of Public Health and President of Cox Associates. And then we have Mr. Jerry Sweeney, who's the President and CEO of Rain Oil Carbon. So once again, welcome to all of you. Each of you will be given 5 minutes to make an opening statement, and once we've concluded that, then the panel, I'm sure, will have a lot of questions for all of you. So, Mr. McKay, I'll recognize you for your 5-minute opening statement. And I might just mention that on the table there are 2 little monitors there, and if it's working, a little red light will come on when your time has expired. So we don't expect you to end immediately, but if you would notice that periodically, that would be great. So you're recognized, Mr. McKay.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the subcommittee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. My name is Rob Mackey, and I'm President and CEO of the American Bakers Association. ABA is the voice of the wholesale baking industry in the United States. ABA advocates on behalf of more than 700 baking facilities and baking company suppliers nationwide. ABA members produce bread, rolls, crackers, bagels, sweet goods, tortillas, and many other wholesome, nutritious baked products for America's families. The baking industry generates more than $102 billion in economic activity annually, and we employ over 630,000 highly skilled employees in the industry. I would like to share our industry's concerns regarding the EPA's tailoring rule and its impact on the baking industry. If the Clean Air Act CO2e trigger thresholds are lowered from 100,000 tons per year to 250 tons per year, many more bakeries will be subjected to expensive and unnecessary Title V requirements and prevention of significant deterioration, or PSD, regulations. the cost to impacted bakeries could be devastating. Approximately 20% of baking industry is currently covered under Title V permits. Many bakers have accepted federally enforceable limits on production, otherwise known as synthetic minor permits, to minimize their emissions and to avoid the cost and regulatory burden of the Title V permit program. If the potential CO2e emissions threshold is lowered to 250 tons per year, a much larger portion of the baking industry would be forced into the Title V process. This would needlessly increase compliance costs, seriously constrict bakers' ability to respond to market demand, and potentially require expensive controls on CO2 emissions, despite the industry already relying upon clean natural gas for its ovens. Importantly, EPA would likely state that its PSD regulations also cover so-called biogenic CO2 processes, including the natural fermentation of yeast from rising dough. In 2009, Administrator Jackson promised that the EPA would not regulate, quote, every cow and Dunkin' Donuts, unquote, but that is exactly what would happen. Let me explain in more detail. There are 3 stages of the baking process. First, ingredients such as flour, sugar, yeast, and water are mixed together into dough. The dough is then allowed to rest in a proofing area where the yeast ferments sugars in the dough to create CO2 and ethanol that makes the dough rise. I can remember when my grandmother getting very upset if I was running through the kitchen and disturbed her rising dough and cake in her kitchen. While the scale is different, the process is the same in a commercial bakery. After rising, the dough is then baked in a clean natural gas-fired oven at temperatures ranging from 180 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Many bakery products, particularly breads and sweet goods, are made with yeast. Yeast is not an unpronounceable industrial chemical. It's a living, breathing organism that creates a natural chemical process. Yeast cells use food, moisture, warmth, and air to ferment and help the dough rise and create CO2 as a byproduct like we do when we breathe. Yeast is the most commonly used leavener in bread making and serves 3 main functions. First, CO2 production during yeast fermentation results in stretching and expansion of the dough, giving bread its characteristic open structure as well as the nooks and crannies. Second, yeast fermentation strengthens the flour in the dough so it better captures and holds the CO2 that is produced. Finally, yeast fermentation provides the distinctive flavors, aromas, and texture that make baked products so appealing. As bread dough is baked, the CO2 that was produced by the yeast activity is released. The emissions from yeast in bread production are extremely difficult to estimate. Any EPA rule that requires precise quantification will be technologically challenging and exceedingly expensive. There are several reasons that the Clean Air Act is a poor fit for natural biological processes like yeast fermentation in bread baking. First, bakers make a variety of products that have different levels of yeast. These products change seasonally and with consumer demand. Second, protein levels of wheat change dramatically from year to year. If the wheat is low or high in protein, then the recipe must be adjusted to maintain the proper balance of flour and sugars. Third, there is no smokestack, so to speak, at which to measure fermentation emissions. But instead, bakers would have to use predictive models, altering the inputs every time the product type and recipe are modified. And of course, expensive consultants and additional measuring equipment would be needed to accomplish these tasks. In contrast to natural CO2 emissions, bakers can easily determine their fuel usage for ovens and their contribution toward the baker's CO2 emissions profile. But as mentioned, bakeries already use clean-burning natural gas. Carbon dioxide and water vapors are the byproducts of efficient and clean combustion. While bakers continue to explore the cost and technical feasibility of cogeneration and other efficiency measures, it is difficult for the industry to find greener ovens to bake product. Lowering the Clean Air Act regulatory threshold would sweep many bakeries with considerable economic impacts. For purposes of illustration, a typical mid-sized bakery might have 3 production lines for bread and roll products. Each line would operate an average of 500 hours per month with an average production of 2,000 tons of product per month. This bakery would consume approximately 7 million cubic feet of natural gas per month with annual CO2e emissions just from the fuel alone of 4,500 tons per year, well over the 250-ton threshold but well below the current 100,000-ton threshold. Under the revised Clean Air Act threshold, this bakery would now be subject to EPA's onerous PSD rules in under a month of operation. In terms of biogenic CO2, the emissions from natural yeast fermentation, the bakery could produce 37 tons of CO2 per month, thus trigger PSD review between 6 and 7 months of operation. Bakeries are already subjected to excessive control technology costs for ethanol emissions, which is ironically also a natural product of yeast fermentation. To meet current Clean Air Act requirements, the cost to larger bakeries for adding a catalytic oxidizer on a bread, roll, bakery oven.
Mr. McKay, you're about 2 minutes over, so if you'd conclude.
I will do that. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. The bottom line is the cost of any new overly broad rules that regulate natural agriculture-related CO2 or clean natural gas used in baking ovens will ultimately force American families to pay more for their baked goods. Appreciate the opportunity. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Mr. Schaefer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, my name is Carl Schaefer. I have the privilege of serving on the Board of Directors of the American Farm Bureau Federation and as President of the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau. I'm pleased to offer this testimony on their behalf. As you know, EPA is phasing in the application of its greenhouse gas regulations through the promulgation of a tailoring rule, under which the permitting requirements will apply to the largest emitters first, followed by small emitters at some unspecified future date. But even with this phased-in approach, farmers and ranchers are already being adversely affected by greenhouse gas regulations through increased fuel and energy costs passed down by utilities and refineries. EPA itself estimated that there are more than 37,000 farms and ranches that emit between 100 and 25,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year who would likely be subject to Title V or operating permit requirements. This is concerning since, in the final tailoring rule, EPA estimated the average cost to obtain a permit would be more than $23,000. Using EPA's own numbers, just the expense of obtaining permits will cost agriculture more than $866 million. These costs are a significant burden to livestock producers. While the tailoring rule has thus far deferred those permitting requirements for agricultural facilities, we still have two major concerns with the tailoring rule. First, it can only defer the permitting requirements for smaller emitters, not exempt them completely. The Clean Air Act clearly and specifically defines major sources as those emitting more than 100 tons or 250 tons of regulated pollutants per year. To put this in perspective, we're talking about farms with 25 dairy cows, 50 beef cattle, or 200 hogs. These numbers represent about 90% of America's livestock production, which would be subject to Title V permitting requirements. Even by the standards of my father's generation, these numbers do not describe large farms. Only Congress can change these thresholds. A provision in the fiscal year 2012 Interior Appropriations Bill prevented EPA from currently regulating greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, but there is no assurance that a similar provision will be in place for fiscal year 2013. There is little or no flexibility in the Clean Air Act to deviate from these requirements. Although the EPA administrator has expressed an intention not to regulate livestock emissions, there is nothing in the statute granting the administrator the authority to exempt agriculture from regulation. Secondly, the tailoring rule is one of several greenhouse gas rules that are being challenged in the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Oral arguments were heard on all the rules in late February, and a decision on the legality of these rules is expected in the very near future. A court ruling overturning the tailoring rule would immediately make the feared direct costs described previously become a sudden reality for farmers and ranchers across the nation. This regulatory train has already headed down the tracks and is picking up speed. I want to thank you for your conveying this hearing and the invitation to testify, and I welcome taking your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me the opportunity today to testify at the hearing on the American Energy Initiative. My name is Charlie Smith, and I'm President and CEO of CountryMark. As EPA continues to regulate...
Mr. Smith, is your microphone on? Is that light on?
It is now. Let me start over. Anyway, I'm President and CEO of CountryMark, and I believe it's important for Congress to understand how the process affects companies such as CountryMark. CountryMark's an oil refinery. We're pretty different from any other refinery in the world. We're owned by over 100,000 farmers. We're leaders in distribution of biodiesel and ethanol. The crude we refine is 100% American. It comes from the oil fields of Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. We refine 27,000 barrels per day of crude, which makes us one of the smallest refineries in the country. The other refinery in the state of Indiana is 15 times larger than us. We're a very small fish in a very big pond. My written testimony provides more details into CountryMark's position on greenhouse gas regulations. My oral testimony today, I'd like to focus on a few areas. The cost of regulatory burdens on our industry are dramatically underestimated by the EPA many times. For example, the EPA required CountryMark to install continuous emissions monitoring systems at our refinery. The EPA's cost estimate was that this would cost $9,500 per refinery and would have no impact on the refinery. In fact, the EPA did not even convene the SBREFA process to look at the cost and the impact on small business refiners. In the end, we spent $450,000 to install that equipment. We'll spend $4 million over the next 10 years to operate it. The EPA's cost estimate for that same equipment was $10,000. The EPA pursues its regulatory goals with multiple rules, producing harmful uncertainty for our industry. In May 2010, the EPA issued its final rule addressing greenhouse gas emissions from stationary sources. Under that tailoring rule, existing facilities with carbon dioxide emissions exceeding 100,000 metric tons per year required to obtain an updated operating permit. In addition, facilities that implement modifications increasing CO2 emissions by 75,000 metric tons would require a PSD permit. However, great concern to us is that EPA has then indicated they intend to further restrict greenhouse gas emissions from the refining sector alone by applying another concept called New Source Performance Standards, NSPS. By uniquely regulating greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S. refining sector, EPA directly threatens refineries, especially the small ones like CountryMark. Unlike the tailoring rule, meeting NSPS requirements involves best available control technology, which is frequently uneconomic in small refineries. If EPA uses NSPS rulemaking to drive greenhouse gas limits to the statutory limits of 250 metric tons or less, this would be orders of magnitude more stringent than the current tailoring rule. Because small refiners are particularly sensitive to capital costs, the additional NSPS requirements to meet stricter limits would make modifications uneconomical. That would limit our ability to improve our process, grow our refinery, starts to threaten the jobs. EPA's own rules frequently conflict with each other. For example, EPA required CountryMark to spend $85 million to reduce sulfur in gasoline and diesel fuel. We spent $6.2 million per year operating this equipment. 2 years after the startup of our low-sulfur gasoline project, EPA indicated it would come up with Tier 3 gasoline regulations to further reduce sulfur in gasoline. CountryMark has estimated complying with this additional requirement costs another $15 million. The reduction in sulfur has been done in a manner that's not cost-effective. It's been done piecemeal instead. But ironically, these low-sulfur mandates require us to utilize equipment that increases our greenhouse gas footprint by 15%. The cumulative impact of these regulations seriously threatens our company. Each regulation EPA promulgates is a cost, yet the EPA never examines the collective impact of the regulations. By employing rule-by-rule focus to their economic analysis, the larger cumulative impact is hidden. Yet the cumulative impacts are true costs and are the costs we experience every day. They drive up the cost of our products. They threaten our long-term viability. We operate in a county with 26,000 residents, and we employ over 300 workers. Each year, we put $30 million of wages and benefits a year into that community. We spend $800 million a year buying crude oil from 40,000 individual royalty owners in Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. Total economic impact on the tri-state area is $2.5 billion per year. That's money that stays in Americans' heartland. It's manufacturing costs. They're the jobs that we covet as a nation, both during recessionary times and not. If we continue to increase these costs, companies like Countrymark will be unable to compete with the large multinational oil companies both here and abroad. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. We fully support legislation that would impose rational and realistic cost analysis, cumulative impact analysis, and congressional approval of the EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from refining industry, especially small business refiners. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weiss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I'd like to address several elements of EPA's proposed carbon pollution standard. In 2007, the Supreme Court ruled in Massachusetts versus EPA that, quote, greenhouse gases fit well within the Clean Air Act's definition of air pollutant, unquote. Based on this decision, EPA must first determine whether carbon pollution endangers the public health and welfare. In 2008, then EPA Administrator Stephen Johnson wrote to then-President George W. Bush that, quote, the Supreme Court's Massachusetts versus EPA decision, combined with the latest science of climate change, requires the agency to propose a positive endangerment finding. It does not permit a credible finding that we need to wait for more research, unquote. Johnson also recommended to the President that EPA begin to regulate carbon pollution from major sources. President Bush ignored Administrator Johnson in the law. After the Obama administration made the endangerment finding, it established limits on carbon pollution from motor vehicles and addressed permits for large, new, and expanded industrial facilities. As Congress intended, EPA wisely focused on a relatively small number of the largest new industrial sources that emit more than 100,000 tons per year of carbon pollution, and on expanded facilities that increase their emissions by 75,000 tons per year. This tailoring rule includes the sources of about 70% of industrial carbon pollution. I'd just like to note that the American Farm Bureau Federation, the American Petroleum Institute, and the National Petrochemical and Refiners Association are all plaintiffs in the lawsuit that are trying to overturn the tailoring rule so that the concerns raised by Mr. Schaefer and Mr. Smith will actually come true. The Clean Air Act requires that a new facility seek a clean air permit. In 2011, there were fewer projects with enough pollution to qualify than both industry and EPA predicted. As of December of last year, EPA and the state permitting authorities have issued 18 permits with carbon pollution limits, with about 50 other permit applications pending, or an average of 1 per state. On April 13th, the Environmental Protection Agency proposed the first ever rule to limit carbon pollution from new power plants. The proposal would require these plants to emit 40 to 60% less carbon pollution than a typical new coal-fired power plant. Richard Morgenstern, a former Reagan and Clinton EPA official, predicts that the new carbon pollution standard will have, quote, no net impact on employment. Americans support reductions of carbon pollution. A March 2012 bipartisan poll by the American Lung Association found, quote, after listening to a balanced debate with messages both for and against setting new carbon standards, 63% were in favor of action and 33% opposed, unquote. The Republican pollster who did the poll concluded that, quote, there is broad support across partisan lines for new carbon regulations on power plants, unquote. In addition, nearly 2 million people have already submitted comments to EPA in favor of the proposed rule. Now, some claim that there is a war on coal. This is untrue. For instance, the Obama administration has made significant investments in technologies to reduce carbon pollution from coal combustion. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act included $3.4 billion for carbon capture and storage technology research, including funds to revive the Future Gen Clean Coal Pilot Project that President George W. Bush had scrapped. There was also funds for 7 other clean coal projects. Coal mining employment figures also debunked this mythical war. In May, the Charleston Gazette reported that, quote, employment in the Appalachian mining industry is at a 14-year high, unquote. The nonpartisan West Virginia Center for Budget and Policy reports that coal mining jobs there are rising Energy Information Administration data shows increases in other states too, including Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Coal companies continue to make huge profits. In 2011, the two largest companies, Peabody Energy and Arch Coal, made a combined profit of over $1 billion. Reducing carbon pollution grows more urgent. For instance, on June 16th, a few days ago, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that Californians face an increase in the West Nile virus due to global warming. Now, some in Congress still deny that climate change is real or caused by human activity, even though the National Academy of Sciences found that, quote, 97 to 98% of the climate researchers support the tenets of human-made climate change. The House of Representatives has been a roadblock to clean up. In this Congress, it cast 37 votes to block climate change action. We urge the House to reduce the climate change threat to Americans' health, economy, and jobs by heeding the words of General George S. Patton, lead me, follow me, or get out of my way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shimides. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to talk with you. My name is William Shimides, and I am the Dean of the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. I'm an atmospheric scientist, having spent much of my career studying the chemistry of the lower atmosphere and the impacts of regional air pollution. I'm speaking to you today in my role as Vice Chair of the report America's Climate Choices, issued by the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences. Our 2012 report was the capstone in a 5-report series, and for your reading pleasure, I brought a copy right here, ready for anyone who wants to take me up on it. The report was carried out at the request of Congress and brought together more than 90 volunteer experts, including top climate, social, and economic scientists, as well as leaders from the private sector, former office holders at both the federal and state level. Our reports were all prepared according to the stringent National Academy guidelines for balance, objectivity, and peer review. The reports summarize what we know about climate change and what kinds of response choices we face as a nation. Some key take-home points. First, climate change is occurring, and the recent change is very likely primarily caused by the emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities and poses significant risks for a range of human and natural systems. Second, the environmental, economic, and humanitarian risks of climate change and its impacts indicate a pressing need for substantial action to limit the magnitude of climate change and to prepare to adapt to its impacts. Third, we can always expect to face some uncertainties about future climate risks, but uncertainty is not a reason for inaction. Indeed, uncertainty cuts both ways. While climate change could ultimately prove to be less severe than current best estimates indicate, it could easily prove to be more severe. And finally, while current response efforts of local, state, and private sector actors are significant, they are not likely to yield the degree of progress needed to achieve what we need without federal policies. Much of what we know about the climate is the product of more than 100 years of research, founded on the most basic laws of science, such as the first law of thermodynamics, and grounded by observations of the climate system. While climate models play an important role in climate research, it would be incorrect to characterize global warming as conjecture based on climate models or simulations. As a context for today's discussion, here are some scientifically documented facts about the climate system. Thermometer measurements show that the Earth's average surface temperature has risen substantially over the past century, especially over the last 3 decades, and these data are corroborated by a host of independent observations. Carbon dioxide concentrations are higher today than they have been for at least the past 600,000 years. Most of the recent warming can be attributed to fossil fuel burning and other human activities. Changes in solar radiation and volcanic activity can also influence the climate, but observations show that they cannot explain the recent warming trends. In addition to our careful conclusions about what science has shown to be true about climate change, our report also highlights some motivating factors for why response efforts need to move ahead quickly. First, the faster that emissions are reduced, the lower the risks and the less pressure to make steeper and potentially more expensive reductions later. Second, current energy structure investments could lock in a commitment to substantial new emissions for decades to come. Enacting relevant policy now will provide crucial guidance for investment decisions. And finally, while policies can potentially be reversed or scaled back if needed, adverse changes in the climate system are likely to be difficult or impossible to undo. To move ahead, the committee identified 5 broad areas of action: substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions, begin mobilizing new actions for adaptation, invest in science, technology, and information systems, participate in international climate change response efforts, and coordinate national response efforts. My written testimony contains more information on these initiatives, and the reports offer a detailed analysis of many different options. Key is our recommendation to adopt a flexible approach that continuously assesses new information, scientific knowledge, and technology advances and adjust responses accordingly, an approach we call iterative risk management. Members of Congress, with each additional ton of heat-trapping gases we emit, we commit the world to further climate change and greater risks. It's much like a huge debt. Every time we emit more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, we increase that debt, and we will have to pay it down at some point. Our committee believes it's prudent, even imperative, to act now to limit and adapt to climate change. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Cox, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee, thank you for your invitation to be here this morning. My name is Tony Cox, and I'm an expert in risk analysis. I'm going to discuss health risk related to regulation of greenhouse gases. Several recent high-profile articles in scientific journals and in the press have announced that tighter regulation of air emissions will save lives. The claim is that reducing emissions of air pollutants, including greenhouse gases, will quickly reduce mortality rates, especially among the elderly. For example, a typical headline from earlier this year is, "Cuts in methane soot emissions quickly save lives, climate, and crops." Mr. Rush earlier alluded to healthier constituents from lower emissions, and this is a common perception. I will address the truth and certainty of such claims. The most important thing to know about them is that these predictions are not based on real-world experience, showing that reducing emissions actually does cause lower mortality rates. They do not come from careful causal analysis of real data. Instead, they are based on hypothetical computer model projections and on unverified statistical assumptions. No real health effects caused by current ambient pollutant levels have been established. For example, the underlying scientific articles suggesting health benefits might look at the fact that heart attack rates have decreased over many years and arbitrarily assume that some or all of this decline is caused by reductions in air pollution. Or they might observe that more elderly people die in winter when pollution levels are high and assume that a large fraction of the deaths are caused by pollution. But more careful causal analysis suggests that these conclusions do not follow from the data. When testable causal hypotheses about pollution health effects are formulated and compared to data, they turn out to be mistaken. Predicted physiological changes in individuals and mortality changes in populations do not actually occur following changes in pollution levels. What is left is a set of ambiguous statistical associations that have no clear health implications. The second thing to understand is that the raw data on pollution and health effects are actually quite ambiguous. They do not clearly show that current or recent levels of air pollution cause increased mortality or morbidity rates. Instead, there is no clear evidence of any causal relation between them. Some studies report significant positive associations. Many others show significant negative associations. For ozone, for example, higher concentrations are commonly associated with lower morbidity rates. Scientists at EPA and elsewhere have ignored such negative associations and chosen to consider only positive values in preparing their projections of positive health benefits from further reductions in air pollution. They assume that positive associations are causal, while noting in the fine print that this has not actually been established. In any case, data on historical associations between past levels of pollution and past levels of health effects, such as the data that EPA primarily relies on, do not actually address the question that policymakers should care about most. They do not predict what future changes in health effects will be caused by future changes in pollutant levels. Current projections of health benefits from further emissions reductions rest on a mix of wishful thinking and bad statistics. The third thing to know is that it is possible to do better using more objective methods of causal analysis. The key to obtaining more trustworthy projections is to use rigorously validated causal models and objective tests of causal hypotheses about health effects of pollutants. Many such rigorous tests are now available in computational statistics and related fields. They rely on sound principles, such as that a true cause should help to predict its effects, and that a true effect should be preceded by its alleged causes. But these important required properties are not true for the relation between air pollution and mortality rates in data that I and others have analyzed. In summary, I urge you not to believe claims that reducing greenhouse gases and other emissions create large human health benefits. These claims rest on unverified assumptions and subjective interpretations, not on validated causal models or real-world facts. The more care is taken to use appropriate methods of causal analysis, the more previous claims of beneficial health effects melt away. What is left offers no objective reason to believe that ever lower emission levels will cause ever better health. The point of diminishing returns in health benefits was probably reached long ago, and now we should not expect new benefits from new emissions reductions. The time has come to stop relying on expert judgment and subjective interpretations of data and to start applying rigorous objective causal analysis. I believe that doing so will show that regulation of greenhouse gases cannot confidently be expected to produce human health benefits. Careful study of real-world causes and effects using objective causal analysis of emissions and health effects data will provide a much more trustworthy guide to the true probable health consequences of policy decisions than today's mix of wishful thinking and dramatic claims. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Sweeney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you on EPA greenhouse gas regulation. My name is Jerry Sweeney. I am President and CEO of Rain CII Carbon. Rain CII Carbon is one of the largest producers in the world of a product called calcined petroleum coke. We have 7 U.S. facilities and employ over 250 workers in highly paid industrial jobs here in the United States. We also have operations in India and in China. The majority of our U.S. product is exported. Another aspect of Rain CII's business is energy cogeneration. It is important to note that cogeneration of energy is very important to our competitiveness. It allows us to capture byproduct heat and lower our costs while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. 3 of our facilities in the U.S. have cogeneration plants, and our 4th is under construction currently. Rain CII and the industrial business community are concerned about the existing and future regulation that create uncertainty and threaten high costs, both of which stymie capital investment, job creation, and impair competitiveness of existing facilities. To be clear, the business community is not against responsible clean air regulation. What regulation we put in place must be necessary and not sacrifice industrial competitiveness and jobs. Specific to greenhouse gas emissions, policies that provide incentives such as investment tax credits, grants, or accelerated depreciation are more effective and create jobs and are a preference to more regulation. It is a concern that our facilities would be regulated under the Clean Air Act tailoring rule for facilities that emit 100,000 tons per year and would require a permit under the Prevention of Significant Deterioration, or PSD, pre-construction permit program and Title V operating permit program. Both are lengthy and costly programs. We know this because we are already regulated under them. Our experience is that regulations, while well-meaning, can be conflicting in purpose, reduce competitiveness, and result in less than optimal environmental benefit. We believe this will be the result when EPA promulgates regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. EPA greenhouse gas regulations will impact the manufacturing sector in 2 ways. once from higher costs placed directly on our operations, and secondly, through higher electricity prices that get passed on to us. A loss of jobs will result from both burdensome cost and bureaucratic delay. For instance, we sit before you today waiting for a determination by EPA on the impact of acid rain program, CAIR, and the cross-state air pollution rule on an existing energy cogeneration project now under construction and upon which we have had discussions with the EPA over the last 5 months. It is an example where the rules have become so complicated and the program so overlapping that significant delay is involved in attempting to interpret requirements, even though EPA has competent and well-meaning professionals examining the project. The delay exists even though the project is a green cogeneration facility that will result in significant reductions in greenhouse gas and criteria pollutants, increase jobs, competitiveness, and generate tax revenue for the government. Delays in regulatory uncertainty cause industry to avoid investment and job creation and renders us uncompetitive against other countries. Adding a new EPA Clean Air Act greenhouse gas regulation will increase costs and cause further delays in bureaucracy. Commercial industrial opportunities, when they arise, must be seized, or they disappear in favor of more nimble competition abroad. As for cost competitiveness, an unlevel regulatory playing field against U.S.-based manufacturing production will favor production from offshore facilities. By example, our facilities in India and China are not burdened by greenhouse gas regulation. In addition, our Indian facility has benefited from emission credits for adding cogeneration to its process. One need only contrast that with the methods that are being proposed to be used to regulate greenhouse gas under the Clean Air Act for our U.S. facilities, which would represent a burden and restriction without incentive. There is no question that Clean Air Act regulation of greenhouse gas emissions will deter production, investment, and job creation in the U.S. in favor of other countries. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney, and thank all of you for your testimony. And this time I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Dr. Cox, I was looking at your biography or background. You have multiple degrees from Harvard, Stanford, MIT. Do you have one from Duke as well? Or?
I have not yet had the privilege.
Okay. But I understand you also have a PhD in risk analysis. You're a member of the National Academy's Board on Mathematical Sciences and their applications, and you're an honorary full professor of mathematics at the University of Colorado at Denver. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in your professional opinion, and you've looked at this closely, are there public health risks from greenhouse gas emissions?
No, there are not public health risks from inhalation of greenhouse gases. To the extent that greenhouse gases affect temperature, there may be effects on public health. For example, typically elderly mortality rates decrease as temperature warms. Conversely, typically elderly mortality rates increase if temperatures grow cooler. So there could be a temperature-related impact on public health, but not, I think, a toxic impact on public health.
And are you aware of any rigorous risk assessment performed for health effects from greenhouse gases?
No. I'm aware of many computer simulation studies, but no rigorous causal analyses.
Now, EPA and others, whenever they talk about this regulation and many others, they emphasize the health benefits. And are there any scientifically provable health benefits of the greenhouse gas regulations?
To my knowledge, there is no proved human health benefit from such regulation.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Smith, you're President and CEO of Country Mark, and it's my understanding that's a small refinery. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it is.
And you're a cooperative. You're not a for-profit company. Is that correct?
That's correct.
and you basically provide most of your product to the farming community. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, it's my understanding that you have spent or will spend nearly $100 million over a 10-year period to comply with EPA's low sulfur fuel requirements just to stay in business. And yet these changes have increased greenhouse gas emissions. Is that correct, and would you elaborate on that? So you're spending $100 million to comply, and you're increasing greenhouse gas emissions.
That's correct. And the increase comes from two main areas. The first is we used to burn hydrogen in our process heaters, which would result in virtually no greenhouse gas emissions. We've had to take that hydrogen and use it to desulfurize the fuels, which then replaces it with natural gas, which increases CO2 emissions. And in addition to that, there's a variety of other process changes that also increase the emissions themselves. It's the way you have to desulfurize fuel.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Schaefer, we've been talking about this tailoring rule, and EPA admits in the tailoring rule that the agency underestimates the full impact the Clean Air Act greenhouse gas regulations would have on farmers. Without the tailoring rule, and there are many people who do not believe that it is legal because the statute clearly says 250 tons per year instead of 100,000. But in absence of the tailoring rules, such regulations could affect everything, and I want you to tell me if this is correct, everything from manure management to space heating to operating pumps for drying and curing and more. I mean, it seems to me that these regulations clearly penetrate deep into many phases of the farming process. Would you agree with that statement?
Very much so. They'd have a dramatic economic burden on the average size or small farms, too, all size farms.
And if this happens, this would be unprecedented for the farming and agricultural community, wouldn't it?
We've never experienced something like this, and to be frank, I honestly don't know how we would be able to deal with the cost. We're price takers, naturally, not price makers. So we would have to try to absorb that, and there's just no way they could do it. Our analysis team in Pennsylvania did a study last year. There was approximately $1.09, I believe it was, profit per hundredweight in the dairy industry. This cost would put that at in the red just on the cost of the permitting requirement.
Okay. Well, my time's expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dean Chemides.
Yes, sir.
Would you care to take a moment to explain I see you have a number of titles. You're the Dean of the Nicholas, first of all, you got your PhD. You're the Dean of the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke. You're Vice Chair of the Committee on America's Climate Choices, the National Research Council, and you're associated with you're the Vice Chair of the National Academy of Sciences.
I'm a member of the National Academy of Sciences.
Member of the National Academy of Sciences. What is your academic background?
I got my undergraduate degree from SUNY Binghamton, and my graduate degree is both master and PhD at Yale University.
Yeah. Okay, now, Dr. Cox has basically told me and others that as regards to climate change, one, that it's a hoax, two, that it has absolutely no effect on public health. So he's told me and others who believe as I do that we have really come up with answers that don't answer, explanations that don't explain, and conclusions that don't conclude. Now, I want you to just take some time, and you've heard his testimony. What do you think about his testimony?
Thank you. Well, I have a couple of observations to make. First of all, talking about air quality, for example, and its impact on mortality is a difficult thing to do in the sense if you actually want to prove positively that something kills somebody, you got to kill them, and that's not what we do. So you're left with a variety of different methodologies of trying to establish that cause and effect relationship. And in fact, as a community, we have done that in many, many, many ways in terms of in the clinic, looking at clinical damage as well as statistical results. I might point out, just in terms of air quality, one study that I'm familiar with, in 1996, we had the Olympics in Atlanta. We shut down much of the transportation system. We had a major improvement in air quality during that period of time, and we saw a significant decrease in the number of asthma visitations to hospitals. That's an indication of a cause and effect relationship. It's not as obvious as actually putting someone in a laboratory and giving them air pollution and seeing what happens, but it's pretty good. With regard to climate change, I could say lots of things, but let me just say that I think we can all agree that heat waves kill. In 2003, Europe had a record heat wave, and without getting into a discussion about the role of global warming in causing that heat wave, for about a week or two, temperatures were more or less about 10 degrees above normal. Somewhere between 20 and 35,000 people died in Europe during that heat wave. That's the kind of risks that we face with global warming, and I would say it's a pretty substantial public health risk.
Dr. Cox also asserted that changes in the climate are only based on computer simulations and not real-world events. He asserted that there's no evidence that air pollution leads to adverse health impacts. As a trained atmospheric scientist, how do you respond to those of us who are policymakers, who say that this whole idea of man contributing to climate change is some kind of hoax that has been perpetrated on the American people? Are there any dangers in policymakers telling the American people that climate change is a hoax and therefore it's not necessary to implement policies to address this issue?
Well, Congressman, I don't quite know how to respond to a statement that climate change is a hoax because it's just simply not true in my experience, certainly not in my personal experience. There are two aspects to understanding, for example, what the health effects of climate might be. One is climate change might be. One is to look retrospectively and see what are the kinds of changes we might expect to see in climate change and how have they affected public health in the past. So, for example, we know that if you have major floods due to severe storms, you have major health effects because you have water quality problems that can lead to morbidity and mortality. If we now want to predict how that might happen in the future, of course we have to use models because we're talking about the future. But we are very certain that these are the kinds of things that will happen. We don't know exactly when or how much at a specific time, but we know they will happen, and they will definitely have public health effects because we know they have had in the past. If there's a major flood in North Carolina due to a hurricane, we know there are going to be water quality effects that are going to lead to sickness and death in North Carolina.
The gentleman's time has expired. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start off with a general statement. I was here in the Congress on this committee when we passed the Clean Air Act amendments in the early 1990s. It was not intended to apply to greenhouse gas emissions. CO2 was not listed as one of the criteria pollutants, and I don't recollect that there was much of a debate about it. There was some debate, but not much of a debate. So Dr. Weiss is correct in his statement that we did have Massachusetts versus EPA, a 5-4 Supreme Court ruling that since the Clean Air Act amendments did not specifically state that it wasn't a criteria pollutant, maybe it could be. And he was also correct in his statement that the Bush administrator at the EPA said that based on that Supreme Court ruling that the EPA should conduct a study to determine whether it should be regulated. It gets pretty fuzzy after that because the Obamas came into office and they had their mind made up, and in my opinion their endangerment finding was a preconceived conclusion, and I say that because we have emails at the time that basically state that. Having said that, we're now in the position where the Obama administration is, because they couldn't do it through a legislative act of this committee or the Congress, trying to implement by the executive branch greenhouse gas regulations, and you're seeing the what I consider to be the absurdity of the application. When we put into law back in the early 90s some of these levels for major source polluters, those were quantities that were designed for those specific pollutants. Greenhouse gases are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. We create it. I'm creating it right now. So to try to say that CO2 has to be regulated the same as SO2 or NOx is just simply intellectually, in my opinion, a non-starter. But having said that, once you start down the path, it can bite you pretty quickly. It can get expensive pretty quickly. Now, the gentleman that's representing the American Farm Bureau in his testimony talks about the cost per cow, $182 per cow if you have to get a Title V permit for a major point source polluter, $91 per beef cow, $22.75 per hog. Farms are going to go out of business. They're just not going to do it. So I believe that in the next Congress, if not in this Congress, we ought to have a real debate on this committee about greenhouse gases as applied to the Clean Air Act. I would prefer that we explicitly exempt them by statute. That would be my preferred solution. But if we don't have the votes to do that, we should at least give some guidance in statute to what the standard should be based on greenhouse gases. Now, when I go to Dr. Cox, you were very careful in your answer to Mr. Whitfield's question. If I understood you correctly, you say that for older people, an increase in average temperature generally is a good thing, and a decrease in average temperature generally is a bad thing. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The ill healths in winter more than offset the summer heat wave effect. Of the two, cold weather deaths are by far the more important.
So on average, these small increases in average global temperature, which is called the greenhouse gas effect or climate change, from a health standpoint, on average would be good, not bad. Is that not correct?
I believe that is indeed correct, that on average an increase in temperature will reduce elderly mortality rate.
But as the gentleman next to you has pointed out, heat waves do kill.
Heat waves do kill. Cold winter days kill more.
So wouldn't we be better off, instead of spending trillions of dollars to try to regulate CO2, to have a specific, give every senior citizen an air conditioner for the summer and give them a space heater in the winter? Wouldn't that be much more cost effective?
I believe it could have a significant public health impact.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time's expired. This time I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Supreme Court's going to make a decision fairly soon, and they're going to disappoint a lot of people, whatever they do. The Supreme Court made a decision in the Massachusetts case, and they said EPA must regulate a pollutant that causes harm to health and the environment. I believe those are the precise words, but something along those lines. And the EPA administrator under President George W. Bush made that finding. Now, members of the committee may not like the Supreme Court decision, but it's the law of the land, just like the opening up to corporations to buy all the elections. That's the law of the land. The Supreme Court decided it 5-4. Carbon is not a criteria pollutant, but Clean Air Act provides for EPA regulation over a lot of pollutants other than criteria pollutants. Over the past 9 months, Mr. Rush and I have written to, in fact, 12 times, to Chairman Upton and Whitfield requesting a hearing on climate change, and we've focused on major developments in climate change science and on events that demonstrate the perils of inaction. These repeated requests were met with silence. Instead of holding hearings on the science and the risks posed by climate change, the majority opted to hold one hearing after another, bashing EPA for every effort it makes to address the problem, no matter how reasonable or cost-effective. Republicans on the committee and in the whole House actually voted to reject the scientific consensus that climate change is occurring, caused largely by human activities, poses significant risk for public health and welfare. Today we have Dr. Shamides, a prominent climate scientist who can discuss the climate findings and recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences, where he is a member. The National Academy is the preeminent scientific institution in our country. Do you disagree with that statement, Dr. Cox? The National Academy is the preeminent scientific institution in our country?
As a member of the National Academy of Engineering, I would very much like to believe that's true.
Okay. Dr. Shamides, we wrote letters about the unprecedented heat wave in March and the January temperatures across the country that were 5.5 degrees above normal. We also asked for a hearing on the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that found it's very likely that the length, frequency, and intensity of heat waves will increase over most land areas because of climate change. The IPCC also warned that the frequency of heavy precipitation will likely increase, even as droughts intensify. How do the National Academy of Sciences findings compare to those of the IPCC? Should we expect more extreme weather events like the ones we experienced this year?
Yeah, I think, by way of background, Congressman, I think that of the effects of climate change that we foresee, changes in extreme weather and weather patterns is probably the one that's most immediate and probably on most of America's minds. The data suggests that we are seeing changes in weather patterns, increases in extreme weather events. Our understanding of how the climate works indicates that that is in fact what we'd expect. Establishing that cause and effect relationship is very, very difficult. A given weather event it's almost impossible to attribute a given cause to a given weather event.
The IEA concluded that we have about 5 years to shift from traditional fossil fuel investments to clean, low-carbon energy to avoid dangerous climate change. They also found that delaying action is a false economy. For every dollar of investment avoided in the power sector in this decade, over $4 will be needed to be spent after 2020 to compensate for the increased emissions with more expensive, aggressive technologies and policies. What did the National Academy conclude about the cost of delaying action on climate change? Do they agree?
We generally concluded that the longer we wait, the more expensive it will be to reach a certain goal in terms of carbon dioxide concentrations. For a variety of reasons, including the fact that there are sunk investments, that if we make investments in certain kinds of power plants and energy systems today, those investments will be sunk and will be very difficult to back out from them.
We requested hearings on the impact of global warming on crop yields and the threat of the melting permafrost. Are there National Academy findings or new research on these issues that we should be aware
Certainly, melting permafrost is an issue that continues to concern us, and the evidence suggests that there is continuing melting of the permafrost. What we're most concerned there is the emissions of methane trapped in that permafrost, which could exacerbate the global warming.
We rarely hear from scientists about the threat of climate change and what could be done to address it. If members take one point away from this hearing, what should it be?
The point is that with every ton of CO2 that we emit to the atmosphere, we are increasing the risk that we face and future generations face. And a prudent course of action, a wise course of action, is to begin to address that problem to reduce the risks that we all face.
What risks?
The risks of climate change, which is risks to public health, risks of severe weather, risks of having clean water and adequate water for people. There are risks in terms of geopolitical risks, in terms of international stability. We sometimes think that if something happens somewhere overseas, perhaps in Bangladesh, it's not relevant to us. I think it's very relevant to us in a global society. It enters every part of our society.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you very much.
This time I'd like to recognize Mr. Terry for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My opening statement, I guess, would be I think it's hard to take anecdotal evidence of weather and translate it into a pattern of increased catastrophes. In the state of Nebraska, we're in Tornado Alley, and yet we had a record number of fewer tornadoes this year, or hardly had any. We barely had severe thunderstorms this year. So if you're in Nebraska, to sit there and say there's an increase in tornadoes, we're not going to buy into that. Secondly, yeah, we have had a warmer spring than usual, and it's interesting. I think we have had a couple of highs that broke records on 2 days, and they broke records from the 1890s. So was there man-made cause heat wave in 1890? So I guess we can classify that kind of data as more of opinion to fit into philosophy. I'm more concerned about getting actual facts that we can rely on. But even though I represent Omaha, Nebraska, which is more cement than dirt, I come from an ag state. So I'd like to ask, is it Mr. Schaefer? I can't see from the gentleman from Virginia. Makes a better door than a window. Thank you, Mr. Griffith. But we have lots of row crops. Can you tell me very quickly if you're going to have an average farm of 700 to 800 acres with the tilling, the planting, and the harvesting in 1 year, what the potential greenhouse gas emissions would be?
Would you repeat that? What the potential?
Take an average farm in Indiana or Nebraska or Pennsylvania, I guess. In Nebraska, it's around 700, 800 acres. Say you're planting all corn. What's going to be the yearly emissions? Is it going to be under or over 100 or 250 tons per year of greenhouse gas?
It's going to be over.
Okay. And that would trigger PSD or Title V?
Permitting operating, and if it's over the 250 they're talking about, would trigger construction permits. And that becomes critical at a time when we're urging young people to enter into farming and coming back on the farm. So when you have a father that wants to allow for a son or daughter to enter the operation, most of the time you have to...
I'm going to interrupt there because I need to get to the next part, which is ranching. Let's just say cattle, or in Nebraska we have some dairy and lots of hog operations. You went through in your testimony specifically the cost per cow, cost per pig. In your calculations, did you calculate the methane at 25 times, 26 times, or 72 times, because all three of them have been thrown out in the discussion of equating it to greenhouse gas? Or was it a one-to-one?
It was 4 times the cow equivalent, for instance, on dairy.
Okay.
That brings you up to the tons of pollutants that would be considered.
And in Nebraska, most of our feedlots have significantly more than 25. They'll have hundreds. What can you do to construct to eliminate or get the tons below 250 tons per year in a feedlot?
The only thing you can do is reduce the number of animals.
What's going to be the impact on food prices and farming operations if you have to just take a number of feeder cows down to less than, let's say, 10 or 15 cows?
The result is the American consumer is going to be living off imported food.
Thank you very much. I have more, but I'll wait.
Thank you very much. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before my colleague from Nebraska leaves, I noticed yesterday it was actually about 7 degrees hotter in Omaha, Nebraska than it was in Houston, Texas, which is amazing. And I wish I was a business major and went to law school so we don't deal in absolutes. But I also understand that we have an issue that our experts and our scientists say we need to deal with, and I think our issue ought to be how can Congress do it. I know last Congress we passed a cap and trade bill that couldn't get hardly a majority vote in the Senate, so that's not the solution, but we need to look for solutions of how we can do to deal with carbon release over a period of years. And hopefully we'll get to that point. Mrs. Shamiditis, you served as Vice Chair of the National Research Council panel that produced the America's Climate Choices. The report requested by Congress to investigate how the United States should respond to the challenge of climate change. Your report examined the causes and consequences of climate change and made recommendations on how to address that. And I've always said we should be working on the solutions, like I said earlier, and I think Congress should be the lead on developing our policy instead of the EPA. Can you explain what role the National Research Council recommended for Congress in addressing climate change?
Certainly, Congressman. In looking at the issues with regard to limiting emissions, it was our judgment that probably something that had a market-based approach would probably be most effective, most efficient economically. However, if a market-based approach was not in the offing, we felt that there were other mechanisms that would make sense, including perhaps using the Clean Air Act to begin to limit emissions. We also saw a significant role for Congress in trying to organize adaptation processes. I might point out that in thinking about responding to climate change, we're talking about a process that's going to probably take us many, many decades, and we're thinking about the first baby steps that we take, and I think that Congress can play a significant role, and our committee felt that Congress could play a role specifically in trying to figure out how to level the playing field in the marketplace so that the true impacts of carbon emissions would be reflected in its price.
Okay. I know that for a successful policy we need to develop, we have to promote economic growth. And again, we're in a political system here, so it has to be something we have a lot of buy-in from, not only from rural areas, but urban areas and Republicans, Democrats, and everyone. But some people say that any policy change to address climate change is only going to do harm to our economy. Can you respond to that? Your report looked at these issues and global competitiveness.
Certainly, I can address it to some extent. I'm not an economist, so I need to be careful. We felt, and I think a lot of economists feel, that there are great opportunities for American competitiveness in the green technology area, that these, in fact, will be the technologies of the 21st century, and that in developing a significant federal policy around climate, we could also at the same time increase our competitiveness on those technologies, for example.
Well, and I share the concern, for example, from the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau that if the United States makes these decisions and price our production capability, whether it's refineries in my area or chemical plants or ag products, all we'll do is transfer that to other countries to provide that. And that's my concern, that we can do some things with the political will we have now maybe, but if we're really going to solve this problem, we have to have international buy-in, particularly from the emerging countries like China and India, who actually have economic growth as more important than air quality issues. But we also don't want to transfer all our capability for production, again, whether it's ag or whether it's manufacturing, to those countries, because then we won't have the economics. But I also know in your statement you said that possibly by the turn of the century, Texas could be looking at 120 days a year of temperature exceeding 100 degrees. We made a pretty good down payment on it last year, and it's almost like we're paranoid now, because if we go a week or 10 days without rain, we start worrying about whether we're going to have another drought like we did last year. So although, in all honesty, we've had floods in North Carolina throughout recorded history, we've had droughts throughout history in Texas, but I think Congress ought to do some things to get us on that road, and I think that's where we ought to go from this hearing. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess let me get you, Mr. Wise, out of the way first. Your comments earlier were disturbing when you say there's no war on coal. You know better than that. When the president comes out and says, I'm going to bankrupt any new coal-fired powerhouse, when Stephen Chu says the coal is his worst nightmare, when the vice president says that they're not going to support clean coal technology, there will not be clean coal, when the president slashes the funding for National Energy Technology Lab for its work in clean coal technology by 41%, I'm astounded that you can sit there and say there's no war on coal. When I have a list of 20-some companies, 20-some powerhouses in just my immediate area that have been shut down because of this war on coal, when the thousands of people that have lost their jobs that work there know fully well that it's because of the EPA's aggressiveness, I'm astounded. People in Miami Fort, Beckford, Bickway, Bayshore, Lakeshore, Avon Lake, Ashtabula, East Lake, Niles, Conesville, Muskingum River, Armstrong, Newcastle, Shawsville, Titus, Portland, Elmrama, Albright, Cameron, Reevesville, Willow Island, Kanawha, Phillipsport. I would just suggest, Mr. Wise, you go to those neighborhoods and you tell them this is not a war on coal when they're sitting there home without a job. Mr. Cox, if I could go to you a little bit on the thing.
Please.
Your comments have been interesting about health, air quality. I'm just curious, given that the World Health Organization's own statistics have indicated that indoor air quality is twice as hazardous, twice the people have died. Excuse me, let me correct that. Twice the number of people have died due to indoor air quality than outdoor air quality. Are you aware of that?
I don't think that I was, no.
I'm sorry?
No.
Okay. Also, that the EPA came out in their own website saying the indoor air quality is 96 times worse than outdoor air quality. I'm trying to understand as an engineer. Someone needs to teach me, then why are we so focused on shutting down our plants and our facilities and putting people out of work when the real threat to our health and safety is on indoor air quality?
Yeah. I think that there is a natural human tendency, as Dr. Tremedi's illustrated with the Atlanta example, to say, well, sometimes things go up, sometimes they go down. If only we could control the decrease in mortalities, it would be great for constituents. It would be great for public health. And what they forget is to look quantitatively at questions like Was there a reduction in mortality rate in Atlanta, for example, that was any greater than the reductions elsewhere that wouldn't have occurred anyway? The comparison between indoor and outdoor air pollution is similarly a matter of numbers, not a matter of direction or of hope. So when I refer to wishful thinking and bad statistics as the basis for conclusions such as the false conclusion drawn from the Atlanta study, a conclusion that the Health Effects Institute has recently rejected, for example, I think that a lot of this turns on our intuitive feeling that qualitative direction matters and are forgetting to look at the numbers
do you
and
think
quantity.
If I could, Dr. Cox, do you think we should be spending more time perhaps looking at our indoor air quality? Because I'm hearing a lot of testimony here over the last 18 months about all these premature deaths and the like caused by outdoor and these greenhouse gas emissions, but yet if the indoor air quality is 96 times worse, how do we differentiate that person got an asthma attack because of greenhouse gas emissions as compared to their indoor situation, whether
Yes.
someone in their house was smoking a cigarette? How do you differentiate that?
So excellent question. For the purposes of our tight time constraint here, let me just say that there are excellent and readily available quantitative methods for causal analysis that allow one to compare indoor and outdoor pollution effects, for example. It is not true that this is a very difficult matter and causation is ambiguous. All we need to do is to look at the issues that you're raising or the issues that Dr. Chimides raised using readily available quantitative methods. These methods are documented in my written testimony.
Thank you. Thank you. Back my time.
Thank you, Mr. McKinley. At this time, the Chair recognizes a gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me make it clear that indoor air is not just somebody smoking a cigarette, because everybody wants to vilify cigarettes, but oftentimes the problems from indoor air come from cats, dogs, human existence, dust, and trapped pollens, tree pollens, etc. And that's one of the things that we have to deal with, and why sometimes it's better to open your windows up and let a little fresh air in. And so I do appreciate my colleague from West Virginia pointing out both the war on coal and indoor air, but I don't want folks out there who might be watching this on C-SPAN to think it's only the cigarette smoke that's causing the problem. It's things that every household has, depending on the individual and their particular makeup, that may be influenced or affected by that. That being said, I have to also associate myself with the comments of Mr. Green. I think that one of the problems that we have, Dr. Chimides, is, and I apologize if I mispronounced that, I'm trying to get it right. Good. Thank you. One of the problems that I have is that if we take fixes to global warming that are extremely expensive and chase our industries out of this country, they're going to places like Bangladesh, China, India, where they're not paying attention. And you would have to agree with me that we don't breathe air that's only circulating around the United States of America. We breathe air, particularly in the northern hemisphere, but throughout that comes from places in the globe. And so without international cooperation where they are doing the same kinds of things that we are doing, the problems that you see are going to continue to expand no matter what we do. Is that not true?
Congressman Griffith. Griffith, right? I got you right. Oh, thank
you.
You
got me right.
Okay, thank you. You got my name right. I got yours. Clearly, this is an international problem, and if the United States acts alone, it will be futile. We must get the world to act in unison. Traditionally, I think of America as being a world leader, and I think we need to do leadership. I think there are certain things that we can do within our borders. There are certain things that we can do to protect our economy at the borders in terms of how goods flow inside and outside our borders to and from foreign countries. But ultimately, we need to lead the world in terms of this global problem.
But if we put such huge pressures on American industries that they take their jobs to these other parts of the world, wouldn't you agree with me that intuitively we're actually making the problem worse, and then what we ought to be looking for are the low-cost fixes and not the high-cost fixes, and that the EPA is looking at all kinds of fixes, but tremendous numbers of their fixes, the regulations they've come out with in the last few years, have been very costly, and that if we continue down this path with these costly regulations, we're going to kill American jobs to no gain We may have the right to put on the mantle of some form of moral leadership, but we will have lost jobs. Would you not agree with that?
Well, I'm not in a position to.
I hate to do yes or no.
That's fine, but I'm not. Well,
I'll
I'll say a really quick yes or no. I'm not in a position to argue about to talk to you about the cost of these regulations. I think that I suspect that there are things that we can do to begin to get us down the road towards lowering our greenhouse gas emissions, improve ourselves competitively in the global market.
Well,
and those are the things we should be looking
you
at.
even indicated in one of your articles somewhere that if we had a meatless day, we could actually help climate control because we wouldn't have as many cows and all the production costs.
Yes.
Dr. Cox, in that regard, in regard to the expense and global warming, when I asked Lisa Jackson last year about their determination that it was harmful, that global warming was harmful, I asked her if they studied what happens when people who are poor cannot afford to heat their homes properly, and doesn't that have a health cost? She indicated there were programs for that. My people in my district tell me otherwise, that the programs run out of money long before winter ends. Would you agree that people who are living in areas where it does get cold and who do not have adequate heat are more likely to be negatively impacted in their health than the temperature warming?
Yes, I would.
And would you also agree with me that when the President said, because I'm capping greenhouse gases, coal power plants, natural gas, you name it, whatever the plants were, whatever the industry was, they would have to retrofit their operations. That will cost money. They, talking about the power plants, will pass that money on to consumers, that's far higher. That cost is going to be a far bigger burden on the working poor, the elderly, and just the poor generally, the unemployed. That it's going to be a higher cost on them, and that they're more likely to be unable to afford to heat their homes in the wintertime and thus have higher health impacts.
That seems very plausible to me, yes.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it, and I yield back my 4 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to direct my questions to Mr. Schaefer here to start with. First of all, I have to say it's interesting to me as a regulatory matter that we've got this CO2, these greenhouse gases that aren't mentioned in the Clean Air Act. And then when it gets bootstrapped into this to begin to regulate it, they find that the capacity to regulate it under the existing statute is insanity on its face, and thus they create the tailoring rule to dig themselves out of the hole that they created for themselves when they first tried to regulate greenhouse gases under statute. They had no objective to do that. We heard Mr. Barton talk about the fact he was here. I was not, but I've read the statute. It's pretty clear to me that there was no one here thinking or contemplating whether this was the appropriate tool to regulate these very greenhouse gases. Mr. Schaefer, EPA's estimate says that 37,350 or so farm generators would be regulated if they got rid of the tailoring rule, if the tailoring rule was kicked out. Tell me what that would mean. The day the court kicks the tailoring rule out, tell me what these farmers at these 37,350 generating facilities would be subject to and what their economic response would be.
Well, at that point, we're looking about permitting costs nationwide about $860-some million. And, the way it's set up, the cost of the permit is based on animal numbers up to a maximum permit cost of $180-some thousand is a maximum it can be. So if you look at small farms in Pennsylvania, the cost per cow is about $180. If you look at some large farms, dairy farms in California where 40,000 head might be on a farm, there the cost per cow comes down because you've triggered the maximum, the cap. So now you've created an unfair competition, even within our own country, between farmers in one area and another, depending on the size. So they just cannot afford to come up with the permitting. And it's not only the cost of the permit, but you have to maintain it, and you have to wait for somebody to give you permission to operate. You have to wait for somebody to give you permission to construct things. So,
how many years do you think it would take before EPA could get all these permits granted without coming back to us asking for a whole lot more bureaucrats sitting in that big old building across the street?
The worst part is the permit's only good for 5 years, so you have to start the whole process over again in 5 years. Every 5 years, you have to go through this process. I can't see how they'll ever get through it and do it. The sad part of it is there is no environmental benefit to getting the permit. That's the really sad part of it.
Mr. Mackey, tell me what you think. The tailoring rule goes away. Tell me how many bakers go away.
Well, I think there was some comment earlier about being able to offshore, and in the baking industry with a 4-day shelf life, that really isn't an option. Not that our folks would take it if they could, but you're looking at about a $500,000 per bakery line investment to go to the new tailoring rule threshold. That's $2.19 per loaf of bread. That's an awful lot of loaves of bread that you have to sell to break even, so that the hole gets deeper for the industry. So the cost is a significant issue on top of what is already in place through the original Clean Air Act amendments.
Great, thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank you, and I appreciate the testimony by all the panelists. I served for 2 years on the Select Committee on Global Climate Change that Mr. Markey chaired, and learned a lot along that period of time. Mr. Schaefer, I want to go back to you. My dear friend and colleague from Nebraska was asking about the effect on farmers, and I want to follow up because it strikes me. I represent a district that's 70,000 square miles of eastern Oregon, larger than a state this side of the Mississippi, very, very agrarian, lots of small farmers. And as I listen to Mr. Terry's very good questions and your answers, it strikes me what we're going to have here is a government-forced consolidation of small farmers into bigger farmers. Am I hearing that right?
I believe that'll put a tremendous amount of pressure on the smaller operations. As I said before, the price per cow, when it's based on animal numbers and stuff, that only the larger farmers would be in a better position to handle this kind of regulation, definitely more than the smaller numbers. Once that cap is met, then the price per animal comes down.
And I guess that's the trouble. I was a small business owner with my wife for 22 years. I grew up on a cherry orchard. And I'm telling you, as I get around my part of Oregon, at least, we care a lot about the environment. We want to do the right thing, but we also need an economy that works. I was looking at the new unemployment numbers in my district, and they're 11, 10, 12, 13. I mean, and I meet with these wheat growers and cattlemen and cattlewomen and others, and they're struggling just now to comply with all the rules and regulations of the federal government. Now, some of my dear friends on the other side of the aisle, I've heard them proclaim that the new regulations being proposed by EPA are actually an economic growth model for the country, that this will create jobs. And having been a small business, I'm trying to figure out how that works. You got to pay somebody to process the permit and do all that, but that never seemed to me to be a very good way to create economy. What are these permit costs going to be, do you think?
The permit costs would have a devastating effect on the economic viability of these small farms. And what a lot of people don't realize, too, just by nature, farmers invest back into their local communities.
Right.
That's where most of their money is spent. And so the rippling effect you'd have with feed dealers and with machinery dealers, things like that, it would just ripple down and have a great effect on the economy.
And don't you eventually end up into just big, giant, multinational farms, in effect, to be able to comply with all this? I mean, I don't know how an individual cattle rancher is going to handle all this. And, on top of, this isn't the only thing they're being asked to deal with, by the way. It just is phenomenal to me, the kinds of costs and permits. I was meeting with a farm co-op manager who's building a new building, and he was telling me, my hometown, little town of 6,800 people, and Pat was telling me, he said, I'm doing my own stormwater runoff as part of this building. I'm going to contain it right here, manage it right here. And the city's really upset about that, because if they could get him into the city sewer system, they could get a $30,000 permit fee. And they're just not happy that he's figured out a way to do this within the code on his own property. I mean, that's what he's telling me. And he has detailed one thing after another with these government permits and fees. And on a $3 million building, he's got $150,000 right up front just in permit fees. I mean, I don't think some of these people understand what's happening out there on the ground, why this economy is so stalled, why small employers are going, I don't know that I want to grow my business or could afford to, and what's the next set of rules and regulations coming down, whether it's the sort of takeover of healthcare and what that may portend in terms of requirements. And Mr. Sweeney, I want to go to you because I understand you do agriculture and do farm and overseas as well, right?
Not agriculture, sir. We're industrial. We're a manufacturer of carbon.
I'm sorry. That's right, because Mr. Schaefer, not Mr. Sweeney. Let me ask you this in terms of the manufacturing. When you compete internationally, do you go up against companies that aren't being asked to operate in countries or operate in countries that don't have these kinds of proposed requirements?
While we have the overwhelming majority of the 2.4 million tons of capacity that we have, 7 plants are here. We have 1 in India and 1 in China. So we actually look at those economics internally in the company and the difference in regulations.
What's the difference?
It's a phenomenal difference.
Which way?
A
lot easier in China and India?
Yes. I'll be careful in the way of saying easier in the sense there's certainly less regulation. There's much more permitting, but my experience has been that the cost of that permitting and overall the limitations that it puts on the business as far as additional cost burden on the business is much less in those countries. It may be the same bureaucracy in the permitting process.
Yeah, and I'm not saying we should go emulate India and China in their environmental policy at all, but somewhere in here we are competing internationally. We have to be cognizant of that. I'm sorry I've overrun my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your...
Thank you, Mr. Walden. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson. Well, wait a minute. Mr. Sarbanes. I recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little winded. I've been running from my office. That's what you do in this business. Anyway, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Chimides, you spoke to 2 responses to climate change. One is mitigation. One is adaptation. And both have to be undertaken, obviously, if we're going to make progress on this problem. I'm concerned about the potential for the federal government's role in the adaptation side of things to diminish. And, of course, I applaud the EPA's efforts to tackle this issue. But as you can see, there's a fair amount of resistance to it from some quarters here in Congress. The reason I'm particularly interested in the adaptation side of this is Maryland, where I hail from, has worked very, very hard over the last few years to really explore all dimensions of how you respond through adaptation to climate change. And has really taken a lead in that regard. It stands to reason when you look at Maryland's geography. We have the Chesapeake Bay. We have a huge coastline. I mean, this is the largest estuary body in the United States. So we have this extensive shoreline. And we've already had instances where there's been significant erosion. Some of the statistics are that in the last 100 years, Maryland has experienced a 1 foot in sea level rise, which has led to the loss of 13 islands in the Chesapeake Bay. And the models that you mentioned earlier suggest that an additional 2 to 3 foot sea level rise could submerge thousands of acres of tidal wetlands, low-lying lands, even Smith Island, which is a treasure of ours in the Chesapeake Bay. And so there's obviously huge potential impact here. So what I'd like you to address just in the 2.5 minutes or so that are left is what are the consequences if the federal government doesn't step up and really engage in meaningful adaptation planning and do that in concert with the states?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. So first of all, with regard to adaptation, let's understand that climate change is already happening, and the full impacts of the CO2 that we emit into the atmosphere today won't manifest themselves fully for another 20 or 30 years. So we have to begin thinking about adaptation regardless of what we do about what we call mitigation. So it's really, really important. And I think that there's a huge role in adaptation for local governments, for state governments, for municipalities, because ultimately that's where the rubber hits the road. The role for the federal government, I think, which will be very, very key, is in coordination, information sharing, empowering communities to figure out what needs to happen. Sometimes when we think about working on adaptation, it's like we're going to take a pot of money and a group of people and they're simply going to work on adapting to climate. I don't think that's the right way to go about it. I think we need to understand that as we make plans on infrastructure or anything in this country over the next 30 or 40 years, a part of that plan needs to take into account climate change. It needs to be an integral part of our thinking about how we're going to build our future and our infrastructure. And I think that's the real key part.
It's analogous, I guess, to when you're building new structures on the West Coast and you have to anticipate potential for earthquakes.
Sure.
You start building into your codes and all the rest of it what it would take to withstand that. So you're saying adaptation ought to be looking ahead, using the models, figuring out what the most likely scenarios are in terms of effects of climate change, and then trying to anticipate that.
Building in resilience. I would use the analogy of building a home worrying about fire. I mean, obviously the plans around fire, the adaptations to fire include the building codes, it includes the sprinklers, it includes an emergency exit situation, ultimately perhaps even moving your home. I mean, there's a wide variety of things that need to be integrated into how we think about the future and how we build our country in the future.
Thanks very much. I yield back.
This time, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair, and good morning, and welcome to the witnesses. Thank you for your time and your expertise. Greatly appreciate it. And as y'all can expect, I'm a Texan, a proud Texan from Houston, Texas, the energy capital of the world. And frankly, some folks back home don't understand how EPA can push such an anti-fossil fuel, anti-job, American job agenda. The greenhouse gas, using the greenhouse gas endangerment findings, tailoring rules, and other greenhouse gas rules under the Clean Air Act, which was never intended. Congress never intended the Clean Air Act to be used to regulate greenhouse gases. But EPA is using this authority based upon a Supreme Court decision that never said EPA could regulate greenhouse gases. They had to regulate greenhouse gases. The people back home wonder why the EPA is not required to do a thorough cost-benefit analysis of increased regulation, taking into account economics, economic impacts, jobs, weighed against the modeled health benefits. In Casper, the cross-state air pollution rule is the best example of what my people back home are feeling. EPA included Texas in the proposed rule 6 months before it's supposed to be implemented. It's normally at least a year and a half before states include in that thing, so they have time to prepare for it and make some of their comments. But we got 6 months. So almost immediately, that same week, the largest producer of power, coal-powered electricity in Texas, Luminant, said they would shut down 2 power plants, shut them down, 400 American jobs going away. Texas is the fastest growing state in the country. And we picked up 4 new congressional districts. And we've got very little excess power. In fact, our ERCOT, the power regulator, said we need to have 4 to 5 more power plants built before the next 2 to 3 years to sustain electrical reliability with the growing population. And Dr. Shimides, I hope I pronounced that correctly, said, heat waves kill. And that was a quote. And if Texas has another heat wave like we did last year, like my colleague Congressman Green mentioned, over 120 days of 100-degree weather, I mean, we shut down power plants like the Casper rule would have done, people will die. Elderly people, young people will die unnecessarily. And so I've introduced a simple bill that requires EPA to include economic impacts like job losses, job creation, power generating capacity in any new greenhouse gas proposal regulation. And I ask all of you, I know you haven't seen this bill. It's sort of a surprise to you, but do you agree with the folks I work for that having EPA do some sort of economic analysis when they're proposing these regulations is common sense. Do you support something like that? And I'll start out with you at the end there, Mr. Mackey, sorry.
Thank you, Congressman. I think it should be just a natural order of doing business on any major regulation, that there be cost-benefit analysis, and there are tools in place. SBREFA is another excellent tool where the impact, the disproportionate impact on in my case, smaller bakers would be very helpful.
Mr. Schaefer?
I really think that's vital to do that before promulgating any regulation, to have all the facts only make sense before the discussion moves forward.
Common sense, yes, sir. And Mr. Smith?
Yes, sir, I would think that would be highly appropriate.
Mr. Weiss?
The best available control technology standards for the new power plant rules and for permits already includes a consideration of economic cost, and in fact, the back standard for getting permits is basically energy efficiency, which will save companies money as they use less energy.
Okay, Dr. Schmides.
I don't have a comment.
Okay, thank you, sir. Dr. Cox?
Yes, I agree that sound risk-cost-benefit analysis can improve public decision-making.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sweden?
I would agree, sir. In any business, it's required at the boardroom table as well as any management discussion. I think it's absolutely commensurate.
Thank you. I got a little bit of time here. I want to just talk to Mr. Mackey down there at the end. I mean, talking with my colleague Joe Barton mentioned some of the crazy things we're having in the agriculture industry with this greenhouse gas regulations. I want to talk specifically about some of the things that happen in the baker's business. You testified that EPA and state agencies have forced bakeries to consider emissions control equipment to regulate emissions from natural ethanol emissions from yeast, and that the cost of the equipment may be up to $80,000 per ton. Can you elaborate on that, please?
And that includes just in one facility in 1 year what the cost would be, and just to try to capture and the issue is it may not even be technically feasible. It's again, there's no central location like the stack out of the bakery oven where you can grab what you have to do with ethanol. To try to capture the ambient yeast emission of CO2 is technically very, very challenging. And so the environmental controls that have to be put in place are going to be enormously expensive, again, because you can't go to a single source to capture it. You've got to capture it along the entire production line where the dough is rising.
I'm out of my time. Sounds like you'll be losing some jobs, some layoffs necessary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olson, and I want to thank all of you members of the panel. We genuinely appreciate your being here and giving us your views and advice and answering our questions. And with that, I'll dismiss the first panel, and we'll call up the second panel.
Thank you.
And thank you again. On the second panel, we have the Honorable David Wright, who is Commissioner and Vice Chairman of the Public Service Commission of South Carolina, who's actually testifying on behalf of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. We have Mr. David Doniger, who is the Policy Director for Climate and Clean Air Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. We have Mr. Stephen Winberg, who's Vice President of Research and Development, Consol Energy. And we have Ms. Barbara Waltz, who's Senior Vice President for External Relations and Environmental for Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association. So welcome all of you. We appreciate your patience this morning as we work through the first panel. And I'm going to call on each one of you. We'll recognize each one of you for a period of 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Thanks for coming.
I want to get your books on and pass them out to my friend on that books.
Yeah.
Pass them out to my friend on the other side. Thank you. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And at this time, Mr. Wright, we'll begin with you. As I said, you're Commissioner of Public Service Commission of South Carolina, Vice Chairman. and testifying on behalf of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush and members of the subcommittee. My name is David Wright. I am president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and I am vice chair of the South Carolina Public Service Commission. NARUC understands the significant impact that EPA's proposed standards of performance for greenhouse gas emissions will have on the power sector and their consumers. Although we've not taken a position either in support of or opposition to the suite of EPA rulemakings, we believe the rules must recognize the need for flexibility and compliance requirements, encourage coordination among generation plants, and provide continued dialogue between federal and state regulators. The EPA greenhouse gas proposal raises concerns regarding resource diversity, consumer costs, and the uncertainty for existing resources. On resource diversity, NARUC has encouraged EPA to recognize the needs of states and regions to deploy diverse resources based on their own characteristics. While EPA says it does not preclude new coal-fired capacity, its emission standards are based on natural gas combined cycle plants rather than maintaining a separate standard for coal units. NARUC members are concerned that this will result in an over-reliance on natural gas. We are fuel neutral, but we know how important resource diversity is to the power sector. Yes, thankfully the current price of gas is low, but no one can predict the future, especially when that future is reliant on a historically volatile commodity. A few years ago, if you remember, natural gas prices exceeded $14 per MMBTUs. Just recently, prices sunk to around $2. Now, speaking for myself, David Wright, I'm very concerned about the impact the whole suite of EPA regulations proposed, adopted, and under consideration will likely have on utility companies and their consumers. As a regulator, I am accountable to the ratepayers. When bills go up, I get calls from irate consumers. While I'm not here to criticize specific provisions within any of the rules, I am afraid we are setting our utility customers up for a perfect storm. My written testimony highlights a few studies from EPA and others that attempt to quantify the cost impacts of these rules. EPA's own assessment of the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards Rule estimates cost of $9.6 billion annually for compliance. Obviously, when you add the greenhouse gas and other rules, the cost will only increase. In fact, studies by the National Economic Research Associates put the cost of complying with 4 EPA rules, MATS, the Crossair State Pollution Rule, and rules covering coal combustion and cooling water intake at approximately $21 billion per year from 2012 to 2020. According to NERA, retail electricity prices in the U.S. would increase by about 6.5% over that period, with certain regions feeling the sting much more than others. These estimates do not include the greenhouse gas rule, nor the billions of dollars needed for upgrading the entire utility infrastructure, which some believe will cost more than $2 trillion over the next 20 years, all coming from ratepayers. Additionally, many predict these rules will negatively impact grid reliability. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation has termed EPA's rules as the #1 risk to reliability over the next 1 to 5 years. I am personally worried that there has never been a formal true reliability assessment of EPA's regulations. The agency has measured resource adequacy to determine whether the total amount of retirements in a particular region will cause reserve margins to fall below acceptable levels, but true reliability impacts occur locally. Some of the units that may be retired as a result of these rules are needed for local reliability purposes, such as voltage support and black start capacity. If these units are not available, the potential for reliability problems could ensue. If there's one message I would like for you to remember today, it's that there must be a better way to do this. I understand the need to continue improving the environmental performance of the utility industry, but we must do it in a way that recognizes the absolute necessity of maintaining reliability and stable rates. Within NARUC, we have a formal dialogue with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and EPA officials, and I personally want to thank our federal colleagues for their commitment to these discussions. But a dialogue does not substitute for the needed study of the reliability and cost impacts of these rules. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. And Mr. Doniger, you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Rush. Nearly 2 million Americans, more than double the previous record, have already raised their voices in comments in support of EPA's proposed carbon pollution standard for new power plants. And I want to emphasize that the standard that's been proposed is for new plants. And more than 60% of Americans support letting carbon pollution standards be set by EPA, according to a bipartisan poll conducted for the American Lung Association. Carbon pollution is imposing staggering health costs through heat waves, more smog, and increased extreme weather. There are two Supreme Court decisions that confirm now that it is EPA's job under the Clean Air Act, as Congress wrote it, to protect EPA, to protect the American people from carbon pollution from both cars and power plants. The second one, which you haven't heard about today, is a decision from last June, American Electric Power versus Connecticut. By proposing standards for new plants under the Clean Air Act, EPA is simply following the law and the science. Power plants are the largest U.S. source of greenhouse gases, 2.3 billion metric tons per year of carbon dioxide, 40% of the U.S. total. NRDC supports EPA's decision to establish a single category for all new plants that perform the same basic function of base load and intermediate load power generation, however they are fueled. Owners and operators of plants they haven't built yet have the flexibility to choose among these technologies when building the plants needed to serve this function. The proposed new standard recognizes that the market has already turned away from building new conventional coal plants due to low-cost natural gas, strong growth in wind and solar, big opportunities to reduce electricity needs through energy efficiency, and even the potential for nuclear power. So analysts from government, from the power industry, from the financial world, from American Electric Power, from Duke Power, they all forecast that we'll be meeting our electricity needs over the next 2 decades without the need to construct new coal-fired plants. Thus, despite all the rhetoric and scapegoating, this standard will impose no additional costs on the electric industry, no additional costs on ratepayers, and have no adverse impact on jobs. Now, NRDC agrees that carbon capture and storage equipped plants are technically feasible today and can meet the proposed standard. We support provisions that EPA has included to facilitate construction of those plants. We have long supported well-designed legislative measures to accelerate deployment of CCS, including tens of billions of dollars of support that would have been provided to power companies for adopting CCS under the climate and energy legislation passed by the House in the last Congress. Now, EPA needs to move forward to start the joint federal and state process of cutting the 2.3 billion tons of carbon pollution from the existing power plant fleet under Section 111D. It's just plain false to claim that existing coal plants will be required to meet the new plant standard. The criteria and procedures for new and existing plants are different. They require EPA to consider costs, achievability, affordability, and NRDC believes that significant cost-effective carbon pollution reductions can and should be made within the existing legal framework. Thank you.
Thank you. This time I recognize Mr. Winberg for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Steve Winberg. I'm the Vice President for Consol Energy Research and Development. Consol Energy is a multi-energy producer of both coal and natural gas. I'm also the Chairman of the FutureGen Industrial Alliance, a 501c3 formed to build the world's first commercial-scale coal-fired near-zero-emission electric generation plant. I will update you on that in a moment. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS as it is often called, is the most important technology development effort underway if the world decides to significantly reduce CO2 emissions. It's more important than renewable technology development, more important than efficiency improvements, and more important than advances in nuclear energy development. The reason CCS is so important is because reducing global concentrations of greenhouse gas is not a decision that can be made by the United States. Rather, it is a decision that must be made on a global basis. And according to the International Energy Agency, by 2035, 70% of the increase in global economic output will be by non-OECD countries, with China and India leading that growth. The result is that these countries will eclipse the United States CO2 emissions because they will continue to build coal plants to provide affordable electricity to allow them to develop their economies and bring their people out of abject poverty. With all of this coal generation being built around the world, if we are ever to come close to meeting any of the greenhouse gas reduction targets, CCS is the most important tool we can develop. Another point worth noting is that these greenhouse gas reduction targets would require CCS on natural gas plants also. We cannot reach these targets by just controlling coal. Unfortunately, CCS is not yet commercially available. We are 10 to 15 years away from when CCS suppliers will be able to provide guarantees, and that assumes that we have significant funding available to commercialize CCS, something that we currently do not have. EPA's recently proposed greenhouse gas rule would require new coal-fueled power stations to meet a 30-year average CO2 emission of 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour with a maximum CO2 emission rate of 600 pounds per megawatt hour by year 11 of its operation. So in practical terms, this means that a power producer would have to begin installing CCS in year 5 to be ready by year 11. Power producers will not make a multi-billion-dollar bet that in 5 years CCS technology providers will offer commercial guarantees. So in effect, what EPA's rule does is eliminate any new coal for years to come because EPA is requiring new coal-fueled power plants to meet a natural gas equivalent CO2 standard before CCS is commercially available. Without guarantees from CCS suppliers, power producers cannot get financing. Without financing, power producers cannot and will not build. We can commercialize CCS, and there are 3 very specific advancements that are needed. First, we need to invest in breakthrough technologies to reduce the cost of CCS. Second, we need to develop a national regulatory framework for storing CO2. A state-by-state patchwork of CO2 storage regulations is simply not workable. Third, we need to build several commercial-scale plants integrated with CCS to understand the cost and operability and to demonstrate that we can safely store CO2 over the long term. I mentioned earlier that I am the chair of the FutureGen Industrial Alliance. The FutureGen project is one of these much-needed commercial-scale demo projects. The Alliance is a group of coal suppliers, power producers, and equipment suppliers from around the globe, and we're working with DOE and Illinois to retrofit a 166-megawatt coal-fired power plant. We will capture and sequester more than 1 million tons of CO2 per year over a period of at least 20 years. The CO2 will be stored about 1 mile underground in a deep saline formation where it will be extensively and transparently monitored to provide the technical knowledge needed to advance clean coal technology. It is imperative that projects like FutureGen get built so that we can commercialize CCS. So in summary, EPA's proposed greenhouse gas regulation will prevent new coal plants from being built in the United States, while it will have virtually no impact on reducing global concentrations of greenhouse gases. This proposed regulation will further weaken our country's global competitiveness, prevent us from using coal, a low-cost, abundant domestic natural resource, and undercut U.S. job creation just at the time the U.S. economy appears to be beginning to claw its way out of this deep recession. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Walsh, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Barbara Walls, and I'm the Senior Vice President for External Relations and Environmental at Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you here today on Tri-State's views on EPA's new greenhouse gas rules, which regulate carbon dioxide emissions for newly constructed power plants. Tri-State is a not-for-profit, member-owned co-op based in Westminster, Colorado. Our mission is to provide affordable and reliable, cost-based wholesale power to our 44 not-for-profit member systems that serve 1.5 million customers in rural Wyoming, Nebraska, New Mexico, and Colorado. Tri-State believes in a diversified, all-of-the-above portfolio. We generate or purchase power from hydropower, solar, wind, coal, and natural gas. However, renewable resources only provide a small fraction of our power needs. The bulk of our power comes from our coal-based power plants in Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. These coal-based power plants are important parts of the rural communities in which they reside. For example, the Craig Power Plant in western Colorado and the coal mines from which the coal comes from employs 750 people and provides $73 million in annual wages and benefits. Unfortunately, the high-paying jobs and tax base that a power plant like Craig provides to rural communities will be a thing of the past if this EPA greenhouse gas rule for power plants is allowed to stand. Simply put, EPA has created barriers that will effectively ban the construction of new coal-fired power plants in the United States. Banning the construction of new coal-fired power plants will have far-reaching and devastating impacts for rural communities that depend on coal for affordable and reliable electricity and for high-paying jobs. EPA provides an illusory concession for Tri-State and other companies that currently hold air permits, but we must commence construction within an arbitrary one-year time frame. Unfortunately, the newly issued Mercury Air Toxics Standards, or MATS, is a rule that is also a barrier to commencing construction within the one-year time frame provided in the greenhouse gas rule. Pollution control vendors have told EPA that they cannot guarantee that their equipment will meet the MATS rule's exceptionally stringent requirements, and they cannot reliably measure reductions, even using the most advanced measurement technology. Without such guarantees, project developers will find it difficult, if not impossible, to find financing and start constructing these new facilities. EPA's greenhouse gas rule will impose a de facto ban on construction of new coal. Tri-State believes this de facto ban is unlawful. For more than 40 years, EPA has followed the mandate of Congress when regulating air emissions from new power plants. Historically, EPA adopted one set of standards for gas plants and another set of standards for coal plants. In this new greenhouse gas rule, EPA drastically departed from this congressional mandate by establishing a new category of power plants that includes both coal and gas plants, and a standard that can only be met by natural gas combined cycle turbines, a fact that EPA readily admits. New coal units that do not commence construction within the 12-month time frame would have to be abandoned or install carbon capture and storage systems, a technology that we've heard today has not been demonstrated and is not commercially available. EPA seems to have adopted a field of dreams mentality regarding unproven and unavailable technology. If you mandate it, the technology will come. Our situation is so dire that the first time in the history of our 60-year-old electric cooperative, Tri-State took the significant step of filing legal petitions for review for the greenhouse gas rule and the MATS rule in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Tri-State supports regulatory requirements to protect public health and the environment, but standards must be achievable and compliance with them must be measurable. We urge the committee to exercise continued oversight over the EPA regulatory process because EPA has gone beyond the authority granted by Congress under the Clean Air Act by promulgating standards that are not based on achievable technology. Additional oversight is also necessary so that we may continue to offer affordable and reliable electricity to our member systems and their member owners. Thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Ms. Waltz, and thank all of you for your testimony. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Doniger, in his statement, said that there is no truth to claims that grouping all new plants that perform the same function, whether natural gas or coal-fired, in the same category under the proposed new source standard is a de facto ban on constructing new coal-fired plants. Now, I would ask the other three of you, do you agree or disagree with that statement? Mr. Winberg?
I disagree because the technology is not commercially available, CCS. we cannot meet, coal plants cannot meet the natural gas standard or that equivalent without implementing CCS. If it's not commercially available, it doesn't happen. In addition to that, under the MATS rule, which Ms. Waltz referenced, that's the hazardous air pollutant rule, the emission standards are so stringent that equipment suppliers cannot guarantee. So in effect, what EPA has done is they've killed coal twice.
Right. And Ms. Waltz, do you agree or disagree with Mr. Doniger's statement?
I disagree with this statement for the same reasons.
Okay. And Mr. Wright, do you agree or disagree with his statement?
I disagree.
Okay. Mr. Doniger, they disagree with you. Now, you know, there's so many issues here, and all of us are very focused on this issue, and we're dealing with very complex problems, obviously, and there are no easy solutions. But there is developing this animosity between EPA and certain members of Congress and vice versa. But for example, EPA refers to the mercury and air toxic standard. It's sometimes referred to as utility, MAC. And when Lisa Jackson and others in the administration came up to testify and were selling that new regulation, they emphasized that the benefits would come from the reduction of mercury. And yet, when the analysis of their analysis took place, and they subsequently admitted that there were negligible benefits from mercury reduction, that the majority of the benefits came from reduction of particulate matter, which is governed in another section of the Clean Air Act. And it is that kind of misleading the American people that creates animosity and makes it more difficult to deal with some of these issues, and particularly when someone like Lisa Jackson, I don't think there's any question but that she has a goal of putting coal out of business. I think that's pretty obvious. And now, Mr. Wright, you're the South Carolina Commission, and one of your responsibilities, I'm sure, is to protect ratepayers and also be concerned about reliability. Now, from your perspective as a commissioner, are you concerned about rate increases, and are you concerned about reliability because of this greenhouse gas regulation?
Yes, sir. I'm very concerned, and which led me back September of last year to file a 209 petition with the FERC to have a study started with us on the impact of all these EPA rules, because EPA was saying there hadn't been these studies done, and they hadn't really been talking to states about it. So we started the dialogue. That's what got everything cranked, I think, and now we have a dialogue going with FERC that EPA is participating in. I'm not saying that we've had any give yet. We've heard a lot, but we're working toward that. But yeah, I'm concerned about the cost to the utility companies for compliance, which are going to be passed on to ratepayers, and it's going to impact rates. They're going to go up. I don't care if you go with the low-end number that EPA is throwing out there or the high-end that has come in some of these studies. It's going to hurt people. Right. And I've got to keep utilities whole.
Yeah. Ms. Waltz, your company's sort of caught in a bind here because you've got to start construction within 12 months, and then you've also got to meet the MATS standard. How much money have you all invested in this plant so far?
To date, we've invested $70 million into the plant to get to this stage with some early design and air permitting. $70 million?
Correct. And you're not sure what's going to happen, I'm assuming?
Correct.
Okay. Oh, my time's expired. Mr. Rush, I recognize you for
Well,
5
thank
minutes.
you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Doniger, do you agree or disagree with your statement?
The statement we were discussing?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I made the statement that there's no de facto ban, and I disagree with my colleagues who disagreed with me. Yeah. And the reason there is no such ban is that the market realities have already driven the decisions on new power plants away from building new conventional coal plants. And I'd like to quote Brookings economist Peter Wilcoxon, who said in April, and this is a quote, "To put it simply, the life cycle costs of coal-fired power are considerably higher than gas-fired power. This is not a theoretical matter. Over the past decade, the electric power sector has responded by adding more than about 200 gigawatts of gas-fired capacity and about 2 gigawatts of coal. And aside from a few plants that were planned some time ago, and such as the Trigen plant, are in this transitional category that EPA has gone out of its way to accommodate, there are no new coal plants coming. And it's market realities that are the reason for that. So to scapegoat these regulations is just that, a scapegoat.
Is the Obama administration, in your opinion, has it engaged in a war on coal?
No. The Obama administration is carrying out the Clean Air Act, which this Congress passed, with a mission to protect our health and our environment, including our climate, from the adverse effects of pollution, from power generation, and from other industries. The goal is to clean up the pollution, and it is a neutral goal. The EPA has gone out of its way to provide a pathway for coal with carbon capture and storage, which is the only future for coal, for new coal plants, to prosper under this regulatory framework. And contrary to one of the other witnesses, Siemens and other companies do provide guarantees for the performance of the equipment related to carbon capture and storage. And there are other projects underway, the Kemper plant, for example, in Mississippi, and two other coal plants, one the Summit plant in West Texas and a plant in Southern California from Hydrogen Energy, planning to do carbon capture and storage. This is something that can be done now.
In my opening statement, I cited a June 6th Chicago Tribune article entitled "Extraordinary Extremes: Climate Scientists Explain Our Crazy Weather," written by two university professors, Dr. Donald Webus and Mr. Aaron Pagman. In the article, these climate experts reported that in March there were over 15,000 warm weather records that were broken across the country. They also reported that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration received 223 reports of tornadoes, way above the 80 that is the norm for March. Mr. Donegan, besides the figures that I just mentioned, the article also outlined a number of additional extreme weather occurrences which they suggested is strongly tied to human-related climate change. Are you aware of any extraordinary weather patterns associated with climate change, whether it be extreme weathers, rising sea levels, coastal flooding, or the like? Can you also share with this committee how these changes may endanger the health, welfare, and livelihoods of ordinary American citizens?
I can say Americans have had extraordinary personal experience with extreme weather in the past year or so. In 2011, and these are monthly records, your article referred to daily records, but we had 3,251 broken monthly records, weather records across the country. And we have an online map tool on our website that tracks these and the destruction they cause. Now, 2012 is off to another record-smashing start. March 2012 was the hottest March in the contiguous U.S. since record-keeping began in 1895. And the year from June 2011 through May 2012 was the warmest 12-month stretch the U.S. has ever had.
Thank you. This time I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Doniger, did I hear correctly again? Let me make sure. You say there are carbon capture commercially available facilities in this country?
what I said was there are manufacturers, Siemens, Mitsubishi, and GE.
But you don't. But there are none in operation right now that are.
There are 3 plants in the works, in addition to the Future Gen plant. Southern Company is building one at Kemper in.
Okay, well, I'm just curious about it because I've got. We have to do it now under this rule. It has to be in place.
No, I have to do it 10 years from now.
Well, but you have to start in the process. What I'm saying to do it now. The EPA said in November 2010 that carbon capture and storage should be evaluated, but in most cases will not be technologically feasible or affordable.
That's for plant decisions,
having said
where
that,
it would have to
I
operate now.
Just chuckled if I retain my time because I just had to chuckle. There seems to be this new something in the water that says we're not having a war on coal. I find that startling and disturbing that people can make that kind of testimony and try to get away with it. Are you suggesting that because even Lisa Jackson went on to say when she testified here about maybe a month ago about the carbon capture that she was going to get back to me with the names of the facilities where they're located. And that hasn't occurred yet. So I'd be real curious to see where we go with that. Mr. Winberg, if I could with you in a relatively short time, you perhaps heard some of the testimony from the previous panel. And they said that again, this outrageous claim that there is no war on coal, and they're trying to use the argument that employment's up in the coal fields, and I just want to say right here in the paper in West Virginia, we lost 1,400 jobs last month in the coal industry. So when you couple that with the realization that we're down from 1.4, 1.2 billion tons now to a billion, just under a billion tons. We're already using less coal in America, but we're exporting. Exporting coal is up 20-some% from approximately 50 million tons to over 100 million tons in just 6 years. Isn't that where a lot of the jobs are being created now, or holding on to, as we're exporting it because we can't burn it here? There is an attitude coming from the EPA that is pushing back against the use of coal-fired facilities and threatening them with new regulations. What would you suggest?
I would suggest that there's more an attitude. There's a deliberate effort to reduce the amount of coal burned in the United States. Various estimates are somewhere between, on the low side, 40 gigawatts out of 300 gigawatts of coal, up to maybe 90 or 100 gigawatts of coal. That would be about a third of the coal fleet. That could be several 100 million tons of coal lost here in the United States. So I think there's a very deliberate effort by EPA to reduce the amount of coal burned in the United States. And
are the opponents deliberately distorting numbers? Do you think that's what's going on here to keep up this message? Because they know there is a war on coal. They know that the employment is going to be affected by it. If they're not aware, just in one state, 1,400 jobs just lost last month because of the lack of use of coal in America, and we're exporting. But yet they're also saying that you go to the West Coast when they're actually trying to stop the exportation of coal at these ports, and yet they try to say it with a straight face. We don't have a problem with coal. Come on. How do you deal with this? I don't understand as a Congress. How are we supposed to not laugh when we hear this kind of testimony?
Well, I think the way we don't laugh is because it's simply not funny. It's jobs that are being lost here in the United States, sir.
Thank you. You go back my time.
Thank you. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Waltz, I heard Mr. Doniger say that the EPA had gone out of its way to accommodate you all. Your comments on that statement, please.
I would say it's simply an illusion. There is absolutely You know, they give 12 months to commence construction, and you have all these other rules that you're facing, mats being one of them that you have to comply with as well, and you don't have a vendor that can design you equipment to meet the standards, and therefore you don't have financiers willing to come forward.
So you disagree with that statement?
I disagree, yes.
And I would have to say to my colleague from West Virginia that I think the language on the war on coal law changed when 40% of the Democrats in West Virginia decided not to vote for the incumbent in the presidential primary. And so suddenly we've seen the language change. My experience also coming from coal country is that coal is under assault and that it is driving up electric prices just as candidate Obama had promised. Mr. Wright, if I might ask you, how many applications from various companies that energy producing companies that you all regulate have come in the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 years to reduce the cost to the consumers of energy because these new regulations are creating so much prosperity in your state?
That would be zero. But we've had a lot come in for rate increases. And if you would go to a night hearing with me, you would learn a lot about your heritage when they start fussing at you.
Yeah, and that's your experience in South Carolina is that they have not asked for any reductions, but there have been increased requests. Would you say that for most of the companies over the last 3 to 5 years that there have been multiple increased requests because of their increased costs in both providing the fuel to power the plants and, this is my experience in Virginia, multiple requests both on the power side and on meeting the regulatory requirements? Is that true in South Carolina as well?
It's very true. In fact, the last few rate cases that have come before us that have been decided, we basically limited it to just the environmental compliance costs.
And are your rate cases similar to those in my home state of Virginia in that these costs, as President Obama said in his famous San Francisco quote, these costs will be passed on to the consumers? Is that true in South Carolina as well, that when these costs are added to the production of electricity, that gets passed on to the consumer?
As long as it's proven to be just and reasonable, yes, sir.
And am I correct? Would it also be your opinion, as it is mine, that the consumers who get hit the hardest are in fact the poor, the working poor, and the elderly?
The large majority of our population in South Carolina is below the median national income, and they are getting hit really hard. And it's not just from the electric sector, because all utility sectors are experiencing problems. The water sector, the gas pipeline sector, the telecom sector, and the electricity sector, and it's going to be trillions of dollars in the next 15 to 20 years.
Trillions of dollars. Is that just for South Carolina, or is that an estimate for the region?
That's in the country.
In the country.
And that is not, that's not including the compliance to these new suite of regs. That's just infrastructure replacement and upgrades now.
And that's trillions of dollars that will be passed on to the consumers, which will disproportionately hurt the working class, the poor, the middle class, and the elderly. Isn't that true?
It is, and in the regions that are coal reliant, the increase is going to be much more than any 6.5%. It could be multiples of that.
And that's why it's not funny. Isn't that right?
There's nothing funny about it.
And how can you explain to me how anybody could be that cruel?
I don't really know why it's happening. All I know is that we're trying to slow the train wreck down somehow. We're not saying don't do it, but we need to find a way to do it right.
And if we had reasonable time to comply and find new technologies to make sure that in fact, not just theoretically, but in fact that technology was available, everybody wants to move in that direction. But if we do it too fast, we end up killing the goose that laid the golden egg. Would you not agree?
If you try to rush to all of this and everybody's trying to push a certain fuel, and then we've heard natural gas, to try to do the retrofits and do all the upgrades that need to happen, or even build new generation, you're competing for craft labor. It's going to artificially drive up cost in a very short term. Where if you gave a little bit more time for compliance, you're going to reduce the impact to ratepayers in the long run.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, in the course of this hearing, I referenced an article in the Chicago Tribune dated June 6, 2012, and I asked for unanimous consent that this article by Mr. Donald Weebles and Mr. Aaron Packman be entered into the record.
Without objection. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Walsh, you've been trying to build a coal-fired power plant in my state for a long time.
Yes, we have.
Unsuccessfully so far. Roadblocks have included our former governor, now Secretary of Health and Human Services, a bunch of environmental groups that have filed lawsuits, an EPA that you just said a few minutes ago has not, in fact, gone out of its way to help you get it done. I heard a minute ago someone contradict, actually. I asked Ms. McCarthy at our last hearing if there was technology capable, if we could find suppliers who would guarantee that they could hit the outcome that is needed to comply with these regulations. She said she would get back to me with the names of the companies. She has not chosen to do so, at least at this point in time. Although today, Mr. Doniger mentioned Siemens. Have you talked to Siemens? You said that you haven't been able to find anybody that can do it at your plant either. Talk to Siemens. They're operating out of Hutch. They're building a big wind plant up there.
Congressman, I was referring to their guarantees about CCS technology.
So there's no one you've talked to, Ms. Waltz, that can help you build your plant that would be in compliance with all of the regulations that you're.
There is not. We have solicited that information.
So why don't you just give up? Why don't you build a natural gas-fired plant or an algae plant or a wind plant instead?
Well, we believe that our mission is to provide reliable, affordable electricity, and there is an abundance of coal in the western U.S. in our service territory, and we believe it can be done cleanly. And we have just gotten pushed so far with all of these environmental regulations layering on top of each other. We felt compelled, as I said, for the first time in the history of the company to sue EPA.
Yeah, and the fact that you've got $70 million of your own risk capital at stake drives that too.
Correct. That would be absorbed by our members, the farmers and ranchers, small businessmen in the rural communities.
Yeah, that's a big deal out in western Kansas. I want to ask the other three of you. Mr. Doniger made the comment that these regulations will have no impact on ratepayers. And I just want to see if there's anybody on the panel. Mr. White, you've already said how much impact you thought it had. Mr. Winberg, big impact on ratepayers.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Waltz.
Yes, big impact on ratepayers.
And so, Mr. Doniger, I'll ask you, when a utility issues a press release after going through a rate review through, in the case of Kansas, the KCC, and they say the reason we went and asked for this rate request was because of environmental compliance costs, do you think they're wrong or are they lying?
Well, Congressman, you're mixing up apples and oranges. What I came to testify about was the proposed standard for power plant carbon pollution. And that will have no impact on ratepayers because no one is planning to build coal plants.
This is what I thought. Let me
on the
reclaim my time.
Mercury standard.
Let me reclaim my time. I thought that's where you would head with that. I appreciate that. So let me get this right. So you set forth a set of rules, and then you observe that the response from the industry is not to build the power plants, that your very rules deny the opportunity to go build, and then you look at the world and say, gosh, no one's building one of those. It certainly must be the case that there'll be no economic impact associated with these rules. It'd be as if I said to my son, there's a penalty for going swimming. And I found he was working in the yard consistently. And I said, gosh, it's funny. There must be no harm to him from not being able to swim because I find him in the yard all day.
Well, Congressman.
This is the logic which you present to us, Mr. Doniger.
No, I think not, Congressman. Congressman, the reason for the trends in the direction of construction for coal and gas is about the economics of natural gas.
Today, Mr.
Yeah,
Doniger.
yes, sir.
Yes, today, but perhaps not tomorrow. Your rules.
And EPA has done an analysis of what would happen if the price of natural gas goes up. It would have to go up 5 times.
I've got but a minute left. We know that
the economics.
Mr. Doniger, I have but a minute left. We know that the price of these various inputs varies over time, and so construction of plants and decisions that economic players will make about the use of their capital will vary over time. To put these rules in place, not knowing whether we will go back to $14 in MCF or remain at $2 or $2.50 in MCF, is ludicrous on its face, and to say it doesn't impact ratepayers is silly.
There is no one.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Back to $14 in the next.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. And I see no one else here to ask questions, so I want to thank all of you members of this panel. We appreciate your testimony and your thoughts on this important subject. We will keep the record open for 10 days, and with that, the hearing is concluded.